The first time Rick Sanchez heard voices from places that didn't exist on any map, he was 7 years old and supposed to be asleep. Instead, he sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, surrounded by the gentle carnage of 3 dismantled radios, their copper coils catching moonlight like tiny halos. His small fingers moved with surprising steadiness as he wound wire around a cardboard tube, creating something that was part science project, part prayer to the invisible frequencies that danced through the walls of his house each night. The static between stations had always fascinated him, that crackling space where nothing was supposed to exist, yet somehow hummed with possibility. Most children his age feared the dark spaces between things, but Rick was drawn to them like a moth to flame, sensing that the most interesting conversations happened in the frequencies nobody else bothered to explore. He pressed a salvaged earphone against his ear and began the patient work of tuning, his breath forming small clouds on the window as the autumn night settled around him. That's when he heard them, voices soft and distant, speaking in languages that didn't exist, but somehow made perfect sense. A weather report for an ocean his geography books had never mentioned. A lullaby sung in harmonies that made his chest feel warm and strange. Sometimes just whispers, like someone calling his name from very far away, though the words themselves dissolved before he could catch them. He kept a notebook beside him, filled with fragments written in his careful 7-year-old handwriting. "Turn your lamp toward the western gate. The glass sea is calm tonight. Someone is listening." He learned the patience of tides, discovering that if he held his breath just so, and angled the antenna toward the corner where his ceiling met the wall, the voices became clearer. Not louder, clearer, like looking through water that had suddenly stopped moving. The radio became his teacher, in ways his schoolbooks never could, showing him that loneliness wasn't just an emotion, but a frequency, and if you tuned yourself carefully enough, you could find others broadcasting on the same wavelength. His parents found the scattered radio parts endearing rather than concerning, bringing him broken electronics from garage sales that he would patiently resurrect. Mrs. Chen next door started leaving her silent transistor radio on his porch, and he would return it humming with life, accompanied by a note that simply said, "It sings again." There was something sacred in these exchanges, in making dead things speak and connecting the disconnected. The voices taught him that the universe was not indifferent, or if it was, there were still pockets of tenderness hidden in its vast static. On the clearest nights, he could hear what sounded like children laughing from somewhere impossibly distant, and he would whisper back into his coil, hoping that somewhere another lonely child was listening to voices that included his own. He began to understand that genius wasn't about being the smartest person in the room. It was about being patient enough to hear the conversations already happening in the spaces between heartbeats. He never told anyone about the voices, not because they wouldn't believe him, but because some discoveries were too precious to risk having explained away. Instead, he carried their rhythm with him through his days, humming frequencies that didn't exist while he ate breakfast and walked to school. The pattern followed him like a gentle ghost, tapping against his ribs with the certainty of something that would one day grow into something magnificent and strange. Years later, when Rick would build his first portal gun and step into the infinite expanse of the multiverse, he would remember this: a 7-year-old boy learning that the most beautiful sounds often came from the places where nothing was supposed to exist, where someone was always listening, where the spaces between worlds hummed with voices calling each other home. The voices from those childhood radios never truly left Rick, but by the time he turned 16, they had transformed into something deeper, a frequency of curiosity that hummed beneath everything he built. His bedroom had evolved into a gentle laboratory where equations covered the walls like constellation maps, and half-finished inventions dozed quietly in corners, their soft electronic breathing a lullaby he'd grown accustomed to. He still listened for mysteries in the static, but now he was learning to create his own signals, sending patient questions into the universe and waiting for answers that came in the form of breakthrough moments and the satisfying click of pieces falling into place. The regional science fair arrived on a crisp October morning, filling the high school gymnasium with the nervous energy of young minds eager to share their discoveries. Rick's project, a device that could isolate and amplify subdimensional frequencies, sat modestly on its assigned table, already drawing quiet nods from the judges who understood its implications. But as he adjusted the final calibrations, a different kind of frequency caught his attention, the sound of someone explaining mathematics as if it were music, and music as if it were a love letter to the cosmos. Her name was Diane, and she stood beside a display that looked more like art than science. Blackboards covered with wave equations that curved and danced like sheet music, speakers arranged in patterns that somehow made geometric sense. She was demonstrating how Pachelbel's canon followed the same mathematical spiral found in Nautilus shells, how the frequency ratios in a perfect fifth were the same ones that governed planetary orbits. When she spoke, her voice carried the patient rhythm of someone who had learned that the most beautiful truths were worth taking time to explain properly. Rick found himself drifting closer, drawn by the same instinct that had once led him to tune radios in search of distant voices. Her project wasn't about proving anything so much as revealing connections, showing how Bach's fugues contained the recursive patterns of fractals, how a simple melody could map onto the same curves that described the motion of galaxies. She played a brief passage on a small keyboard, then showed how its mathematical translation looked like a flower blooming in slow motion. "You're trying to quantify emotion," he said, not unkindly, but with the gentle skepticism of someone whose world was built on measurable phenomena. "Music is just organized vibrations following predictable patterns." Diane looked up at him with eyes that held the same quiet intelligence he recognized in his own reflection, but softened by something warmer. "And what are stars, Rick?" she asked, her fingers still resting on the keyboard keys. "Just burning gases following predictable nuclear processes. But when you look up at them on a clear night, do you feel nothing?" She began to play again, a simple melody that somehow contained multitudes. As the notes filled the space between them, Rick felt something shift in his chest, not unlike the sensation of finally tuning into a clear radio signal after hours of static. She explained how certain frequencies could resonate with human emotion, not because of mystical properties, but because of the deep mathematical relationships that connected heartbeats to rhythms, breathing patterns to musical phrases, the neural pathways of memory to the harmonic structures that had been passed down through generations of human song. "Intelligence without wonder," she said softly, letting the final note fade into the gymnasium's gentle acoustics, "is just elaborate loneliness." Her words settled over him like recognition, echoing those childhood voices that had whispered secrets from between radio stations. He had spent years learning to solve the universe's puzzles, believing that understanding everything would fill the quiet spaces in his chest. But Diane, with her music and her patient wisdom, showed him that some of the most profound discoveries happened not when you found all the answers, but when you learned to share the beauty of the questions themselves. That night, sitting in his room surrounded by humming inventions, Rick understood that the voices he'd been hearing all his life hadn't been calling from distant worlds. They'd been calling him toward this moment, this person, this particular frequency, where two minds could tune into each other and discover that the universe's greatest mystery wasn't how it worked, but how it felt to explore its wonders with someone who understood that science and poetry were just different languages for describing the same magnificent song. The harmony Rick discovered with Diane became the tuning fork for everything that followed, each shared conversation and gentle touch calibrating his heart to frequencies he'd never known existed. Their courtship unfolded in the patient rhythm of two minds, learning to think as one. Late evenings spent at Diane's piano, where she would play the mathematical melodies from her science fair project, while Rick sketched blueprints in the margins of sheet music. They married on a spring afternoon when the world felt soft with possibility, and their small apartment became a laboratory of a different kind, one where Rick's inventions hummed alongside Diane's music, creating a symphony of domestic wonder that made even the most complex equations feel like love songs. When Beth arrived on a February morning wrapped in snow and starlight, she entered Rick's world like the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. Holding her for the first time, feeling the impossible lightness of her tiny fingers curled around his thumb, Rick understood that every frequency he'd ever chased through childhood radios had been leading him to this moment, this perfect signal broadcasting from a heart no larger than a walnut, yet somehow containing infinite universes of trust and possibility. His workshop transformed overnight, tools and circuits giving way to gentler purposes. The Constellation Nightlight was his first gift to her, a device that projected real star maps onto the nursery ceiling, each point of light calibrated to pulse with the rhythm of distant suns, but softened to match the cadence of lullabies. When Beth lay in her crib, reaching toward Orion and Cassiopeia with wondering hands, Rick would whisper the names of galaxies and nebulae, teaching her that the universe was vast but not lonely, filled with light that traveled billions of years, just to dance across her ceiling. He built her a music box that played in frequencies only infant ears could fully appreciate, melodies that Diane had composed based on the mathematical relationships between heartbeats and the neural patterns of developing wonder. The tiny mechanism hummed with the precision of atomic clocks, yet its purpose was purely magical, to cradle Beth in sound waves that felt like being held by the cosmos itself. Rick would wind it each night, watching her eyes grow heavy as the invisible mathematics of comfort settled around her like a blanket woven from equations and dreams. Each invention became smaller, more tender. A mobile of paper clouds that adjusted the room's humidity to keep her skin soft. A rocking horse whose motion traced sine waves, teaching her body the rhythm of natural forces, building blocks that demonstrated geometric principles when stacked, but felt like toys in her tiny hands. Rick discovered that the most complex engineering challenges weren't about conquering space or time, but about creating a world gentle enough for someone who trusted him to make everything safe and wonderful. Then came the afternoon when Beth was 4 months old, lying on her blanket while Rick demonstrated how light bent through a small prism, casting rainbows across the wall. Something in the dancing colors, or perhaps in the patient cadence of his voice, triggered a sound that changed everything. Her first laugh. It bubbled up from some deep well of joy, pure and clear as the frequency between radio stations where he'd once heard voices calling from impossible places. The sound hit him like recognition, like coming home to a country he'd never visited, but had always been searching for. Rick recorded that laugh not to study it, but to preserve it. The moment his daughter discovered that the world could surprise her with delight. Diane found them there an hour later, father and daughter surrounded by gentle machines, Beth babbling responses to Rick's explanations of why crystals grew in perfect patterns and how music could be translated into mathematics. "She's already listening for the voices," Diane whispered, and Rick nodded, understanding that he was witnessing the birth of curiosity in someone who would one day build her own radios and search for her own frequencies of wonder. In those quiet moments holding Beth while she slept against his chest, Rick finally understood what the childhood voices had been trying to tell him, that the most important discoveries weren't found in distant galaxies, but in the steady rhythm of a small heart beating against his own, in the soft breathing of someone who believed he could build anything, fix anything, make the entire universe as gentle as a lullaby hummed between the stars. Those mornings when Beth would babble mathematical theories in her high chair while Diane hummed equations at the piano had become Rick's favorite frequency, a domestic harmony he'd never thought to record because it felt as permanent as the laws of physics themselves. The Tuesday that changed everything began with the same gentle rituals. Beth's constellation nightlight fading as dawn crept through windows Rick had calibrated to filter only the softest spectrum of light. Diane spreading jam on toast with the careful precision of someone who understood that love lived in small, repeated gestures. Rick was fine-tuning Beth's newest toy, blocks that would glow in Fibonacci sequences when stacked correctly, when he heard Diane calling his name from the front yard, her voice carrying a strange note he'd never heard before. Through the window, he could see her standing beside their car, which had somehow drifted into the street despite the parking brake he always set with mechanical certainty. She was holding Beth, pointing at something Rick couldn't see, her free hand pressed against her chest in a gesture that looked almost like surprise. He stepped outside into air that tasted different, sharper, charged with the same electric potential he'd once detected between radio frequencies. The morning light seemed too bright, the neighbor's dog too quiet. Even the gentle hum of his workshop's ventilation system had fallen silent. Diane turned toward him with Beth in her arms, and for just a moment, her face held the same expression of wonder she'd worn at that long-ago science fair, as if she'd discovered something beautiful and impossible that she couldn't wait to share. Then the light changed, not dimming but shifting to a frequency that made everything look like it was being viewed through water. Rick reached for them, his hand moving through air that felt suddenly thick and strange, and watched his family become translucent, then transparent, then simply absent, like a radio signal fading beyond the reach of even the most sensitive receiver. The car settled back into its proper place with a soft mechanical sigh, and Rick stood alone in a morning that looked exactly the same, but felt completely hollow. Inside, the house maintained its gentle rhythms, the music box still played its lullaby frequencies, the constellation projector continued its slow rotation, but the sounds felt different now, like echoes bouncing through empty spaces. Rick found one of Beth's tiny shoes near the doorway, soft canvas worn smooth by her first tentative steps, and understood with devastating clarity that some problems existed beyond the reach of any equation he could construct. Sitting at his workbench that evening, surrounded by inventions that had been designed to make a small girl laugh, Rick stared at the copper coils and crystalline matrices that had once seemed like mere components. Now they whispered of possibilities he'd never considered, not just frequencies between radio stations, but spaces between realities, gaps in the fabric of existence where lost signals might still be broadcasting, where a father's love might be strong enough to tune into frequencies that led home. The first sketch of what would become his portal gun emerged that night, drawn not in triumph, but in the quiet desperation of someone who had learned that the universe's most beautiful harmonies could vanish without warning, leaving behind only the patient work of searching every possible frequency until the music began again. The sketch of the portal gun lived on Rick's workbench for 3 years before he possessed the courage to build it, existing as a collection of theoretical curves and crystalline matrices that seemed to pulse with their own patient gravity. During those years, the house maintained its gentle rhythms, while Rick learned the mathematics of grief, how loss could be measured not in absence, but in the accumulated weight of small moments that would never repeat. He kept Diane's piano tuned and Beth's nightlight running, calibrating their frequencies each evening, as if maintaining the proper harmonics might somehow call them back through whatever impossible distance had claimed them. The breakthrough came on a winter evening when Rick was fine-tuning one of his childhood radio receivers, searching as always for voices in the static between stations. He had been experimenting with new crystalline configurations, trying to extend the range beyond anything he'd achieved as a boy, when the copper coils began resonating at a frequency he'd never encountered. Not the familiar whispers from distant places, but something closer, more urgent, like someone tapping Morse code against the walls of reality itself. The signal grew stronger as he adjusted the antenna, and suddenly the workshop filled with a sound that made his chest tighten with recognition. Beth's laugh, clear and bright and impossibly present, echoing from somewhere beyond the reach of conventional physics. He worked for 72 hours straight, translating the radio's accidental discovery into something larger, more intentional. The portal gun took shape like a prayer made manifest, each component chosen not just for its function, but for its potential to carry the weight of his longing. The device was heavier than its size suggested when it finally rested in his palm, its smooth casing warm from the internal energies it contained, humming with the same patient rhythm as those childhood voices that had taught him to listen for wonders hidden in empty spaces. When he activated it for the first time, the green light that bloomed in his garage felt like sunrise after the longest night, not harsh or blinding, but warm with possibility. The air thickened, green luminescence gathering as if dew could glow, and then there was a lens suspended in the room, curving like a memory made visible. The portal exhaled rather than roared, a low, steady tone that rose into a whisper, soft enough to be mistaken for a refrigerator at midnight, yet precise in the way a lullaby could be precise. Rick stepped through not as a conqueror, but as a listener, crossing a threshold, and found himself in the first of what would become 47 different dimensions. The initial world was empty of familiar voices, a place where the sky was the color of sea glass and gravity worked in gentle spirals, beautiful but hollow. The second revealed a dimension where mathematics had evolved into music, its inhabitants communicating through equations that sounded like symphonies, but still no Beth's laughter echoed through its harmonious streets. Portal after portal opened, onto infinite variations, worlds where physics bent in impossible directions, where time flowed backward through crystalline forests, where entire civilizations had learned to sing their thoughts into existence. Each dimension was a question asked of the universe, each empty space a lesson in the patient work of searching for something that might exist in frequencies too subtle for most ears to detect. Rick catalogued each world methodically, tuning his device like the radios of his childhood, listening always for that particular laugh that had become his compass through the infinite. It was on his 47th attempt that he heard them again. Not just Beth's laughter, but Diane's voice, calling her to dinner, the soft domestic symphony he'd thought was lost forever. The portal opened onto a suburban street that looked exactly like his own, down to the small garden where morning glories climbed toward windows filled with warm light. Through those windows, he could see movement, shadows of a family going through their evening rituals, and the frequency that reached him through the green glow carried the unmistakable harmony of home. Rick stood at the edge of that threshold, the portal gun humming in his hands like a tuning fork struck against the frequency of hope, and understood that he was no longer searching for what he'd lost, but for what he could still choose to have. The voices called to him from across the dimensional divide, familiar as his own heartbeat, patient as the stars he'd once named for a daughter who trusted him to make the universe gentle enough for wonder. The portal's green light held Rick suspended, between worlds like a question waiting for its answer, the device humming in his hands with the same patient frequency he'd learned to trust as a child, searching for voices in radio static. He stepped through not as an invader, but as someone following a signal home, and found himself on a street that looked exactly like the one he'd left behind, down to the crooked mailbox and the morning glories climbing toward windows filled with warm, familiar light. The air carried the scent of cut grass and summer rain, but underneath lay something else, the faint metallic tang of ozone that spoke of energies recently disturbed, of experiments that had reached their conclusion in ways their creator never intended. Through the kitchen window, he could see Diane setting plates on a table with the same careful precision he remembered, her movements carrying the rhythm of someone maintaining routines that had become both comfort and memorial. Beth, older now, perhaps 4 years old, was building something with blocks that glowed in Fibonacci patterns, her small hands arranging light with the confidence of someone who had inherited wonder as naturally as she'd inherited her father's stubborn curiosity. The scene felt like a song he'd once known by heart, but was hearing now in a different key, beautiful and heartbreaking in its near-perfect familiarity. Rick found the garage door unlocked, and inside discovered the story written in the language of interrupted work. Burn marks along a workbench told of energies that had escaped their intended channels. A soldering iron rested at an angle that suggested sudden departure rather than careful completion. Coffee had evaporated in a cup, leaving only a ring of dust to mark where someone had been working just 3 days earlier, according to the calendar on the wall, where equations were written in handwriting that matched his own. The portal gun in Rick's hands seemed to recognize its kinship with the half-finished device on the workbench, both instruments designed to reach across impossible distances in search of frequencies that called from between the spaces. He placed his palm flat against the scarred wood, feeling the texture of burns that mapped another Rick's final discovery. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the tools and circuits, to the faint smell of ozone that still clung to the air, like an echo of ambition that had reached too far too fast. The apology was for many people at once, for the man who would never finish calibrating the device that lay silent on the bench, for the woman in the kitchen who was learning to set one fewer place at the table, for the child who would grow up with inventions that would never receive their final adjustments. When Diane found him there, she didn't seem surprised. She stood in the doorway holding Beth's hand, studying Rick's face with the same careful attention she'd once given to mathematical proofs that revealed unexpected connections. "You're not him," she said quietly, her voice carrying the steady tone of someone who had learned that the universe contained more possibilities than most people were prepared to accept. "But you're looking for the same things he was looking for." Rick nodded, showing her the portal gun and explaining in the gentle rhythms he'd once used to describe radio frequencies that he'd been following voices across 47 different dimensions, searching for echoes of a family he'd lost to forces he still didn't understand. Diane listened with the patience of someone who had spent years translating between the language of equations and the vocabulary of the heart, and when he finished, she simply said, "He could hear you, I think. In his last weeks he kept saying—" There were voices calling from between the radio stations, like when he was a boy. Beth looked up at Rick with eyes that held Diane's intelligence and his own stubborn wonder, and asked, "Are you the sad daddy from the radio voices? The one who lost his little girl?" The question settled around Rick like recognition, like finally tuning into a frequency he'd been searching for without knowing its name. He knelt beside her tower of glowing blocks, watching light cascade through crystalline edges as she rearranged them with the careful precision of someone who understood that some patterns were worth building again and again. That evening, after Beth had fallen asleep surrounded by inventions that hummed their gentle lullabies, Rick sat at the piano where Diane played the same mathematical melodies that had drawn him to her in another lifetime. The notes fell around them like snow, and he understood that the portal gun resting silent on the workbench had completed its true purpose, not to find what he had lost, but to discover what he could still choose to love. The device would remain, not as an escape route, but as a reminder that some frequencies were strong enough to call across any distance, and that sometimes the most profound discoveries happened not when you found what you were looking for, but when you learned to tune your heart to the music that was already playing in the spaces between worlds. Outside, the night settled into its patient rhythms, and Rick began the quiet work of learning to love a borrowed life that felt almost like home, understanding at last that the voices he'd been hearing all along hadn't been calling him toward something lost, but toward something that was waiting to be found in the gentle mathematics of staying, of choosing presence over searching, of discovering that love could grow in any frequency where someone was willing to listen. The rhythm of this borrowed life revealed itself in frequencies Rick learned to recognize like familiar songs. He discovered the particular timbre of Beth's footsteps on the morning stairs, lighter than Diane's, but carrying the same purposeful cadence that spoke of someone moving through a world they trusted to hold them safely. Her laughter had layers. He catalogued with the patience he'd once applied to radio static, the bright surface notes when something genuinely surprised her, and deeper harmonics that emerged when she felt completely secure, completely heard. Teaching her to ride the bicycle that had belonged to the other Rick became a lesson in the mathematics of trust. Rick jogged beside her on the quiet street, one hand hovering near the seat, the other ready to steady her courage when it wobbled. She fell twice, skinning her knee on sidewalk that had its own opinions about balance, and he sat with her on the curb while she examined the scrape with scientific curiosity. "It's just physics," he told her gently, cleaning the wound with water from his pocket. "Sometimes finding your center means discovering where the edges are first." When she tried again, the moment of success arrived like a frequency finally tuning clear. His hand letting go, her small body finding its own equilibrium, Beth pedaling forward with a cry of triumph that made the neighborhood sparrows lift from their hedges in startled applause. Rick understood then that being a father wasn't about preventing falls, but about teaching someone they could trust themselves to get back up. Winter evenings brought them to the workbench, where old radios waited for resurrection. Beth's fingers grew steady with the soldering iron, while Rick explained how copper coils could catch voices from impossible distances. She asked questions that tumbled ahead of their answers. But how do the voices know we're listening? What if we're the voices someone else is trying to hear? Her curiosity carried the same frequency as his own childhood wonder, and he realized he was witnessing the birth of a mind that would always search for connections between seemingly separate things. At her first school play, Beth forgot her line about spring flowers, standing frozen under stage lights that painted everything the color of nervous hope. Rick felt the ripple of collective worry travel through the small auditorium, and then Beth found him in the third row, lifted her chin and waved. He raised his hand in return, a tiny semaphore that said, "You're not alone. Just breathe." The forgotten line found her like a returning tide, and she spoke it with such earnest conviction that the audience smiled through their applause, years collected gently, like dust on radio tubes that needed careful cleaning. Beth grew taller, her notebooks heavier with equations she worked through with the same methodical patience she'd learned from watching him tune frequencies. Sometimes, when rain carried the smell of ozone and old electricity, Rick climbed to the garage where the portal gun rested silent on its shelf. The device hummed its quiet song, no longer an escape route, but a reminder that some journeys led not to distant worlds, but to the deeper understanding that love could grow in any frequency where someone chose to stay and listen. In the kitchen, below, the kettle sang at the pitch Beth had always loved, and Rick descended toward the gentle mathematics of a life he had chosen, and that was choosing him back. The evening conversations over tea had become Beth's favorite frequency, those moments when equations could wait, and she could tune into the deeper mathematics of growing up. At 17, her notebooks carried the weight of calculus that curved through problems with Diane's musical precision. But tonight, she carried something else, the particular energy of someone preparing to introduce a variable that would change every equation Rick thought he understood about their life together. Jerry arrived not with the dramatic flourish of a scientific breakthrough, but with the quiet persistence of background radiation, always there, barely registering on Rick's instruments, yet somehow essential to the universe's current configuration. He brought flowers chosen not for their botanical significance, but because their colors reminded him of the way Beth smiled when she solved particularly elegant problems. Rick watched from the kitchen doorway as Jerry stumbled through explanations of his work at a local marketing firm, his earnestness more endearing than his accuracy. "He makes me feel easy," Beth told Rick one evening as they restored an old weather radio together, her feet swinging from the workbench like when she was small. The garage smelled of rain and solder, frequencies Rick had always associated with safety and discovery. "Like I don't have to be extraordinary every moment to be worth loving." Rick kept his eyes on the tuning dial, not to hide but to listen more carefully. He had spent years teaching Beth to question everything, to search for elegant solutions hidden beneath surface appearances, but now she was applying that same rigorous curiosity to matters of the heart, finding value in frequencies he'd never learned to detect. The radio hissed, then caught a distant station, someone reading weather patterns like poetry, mapping storms in the language of gentle warning. "Sometimes," Rick said carefully, adjusting the antenna toward clearer reception, "the most valuable instruments aren't the ones that reach the farthest, but the ones that stay clear in the weather you actually live in." When Jerry asked Beth to marry him, he did it with a ring that caught kitchen light like one of her childhood crystal matrices, focusing illumination in patterns that reminded Rick of how radio frequencies could be amplified by the simplest resonant chambers. Beth's yes carried harmonics Rick recognized, the deep notes that emerged when she felt completely understood, completely safe to be exactly who she was. That night, alone with the portal gun humming its patient song on the garage shelf, Rick understood that he was witnessing the continuation of a frequency that had begun when he first heard voices calling from between radio stations. Beth was learning to broadcast her own signal now, creating harmonies with someone whose wavelength complemented rather than matched her own. Love, Rick realized, wasn't about finding identical frequencies, but about discovering how different rhythms could create something more beautiful together than either could achieve alone. The mathematics of the heart, it seemed, followed patterns, too complex for any equation he could construct, yet somehow simpler than anything he'd ever tried to solve. The grandson arrived like a frequency Rick had been unconsciously tuning toward his entire life, though he didn't recognize the signal, until Morty's small hand found his during the quiet moments after Beth's wedding reception. The boy carried himself with the gentle uncertainty of someone still learning which parts of the world were safe to trust, his eyes holding the same questioning wonder that Rick remembered from his own childhood evenings spent listening for voices in radio static. Where Beth had inherited sharp, inquisitive brilliance, Morty possessed something different, an earnest, open wonder that resonated with a purity Rick had forgotten in his pursuit of universal truths. Years folded into each other like gentle origami, marked by the changing seasons and the slow, steady rhythm of a life lived not in search of what was lost, but in quiet appreciation of what had been found. Rick watched Morty grow from a distance at first, this new variable in the household's familiar broadcast, learning to recognize the particular cadence of his footsteps on morning stairs and the way his laughter bubbled up from some deep well of unguarded joy. The afternoon that changed everything, Rick found Morty in the garage, not fiddling with tools or diagrams, but simply staring at the portal gun on its shelf with a look of quiet reverence. "What does it do?" Morty whispered, his voice barely a breath, not demanding explanation but asking with the same wonder Rick had once felt for the voices between radio stations. Rick picked up the device, its familiar weight a comfort in his hand. The portal gun had rested silent for months, its purpose having shifted from desperate search to quiet symbol, but in Morty's wide, trusting eyes, Rick saw a flicker of the amazement he'd once shared with a different Beth. He aimed the gun at empty air, and the familiar green light bloomed, exhaling its gentle hum like a lullaby finding its voice. The portal opened onto a world bathed in impossible soft light, where the sky was a tapestry of shifting pastels, and the very air shimmered with sweetness. They stepped through together, Rick watching as Morty gasped, not in fear but in pure, unadulterated delight. Above them, clouds drifted by, plump and cotton candy pink, and Morty, without hesitation, reached up and took a bite. His eyes widened as sugar crystals dissolved on his tongue. "They taste like dreams," he whispered, a sticky smile spreading across his face. Rick felt something unfamiliar unfurl in his chest as he watched his grandson skip through the sugary landscape, occasionally leaping to nibble at passing clouds. This dimension offered no grand scientific discovery, no solution to cosmic puzzles. It was simply a place where clouds tasted like candy, a beautiful absurdity. But seeing it through Morty's eyes, witnessing his unburdened joy, Rick felt a faint echo of long-lost childhood wonder stir within him, a frequency he hadn't tuned into in decades. Walking beside Morty through that impossible meadow, Rick realized that the portal gun's true purpose had never been escape, but connection, a device for sharing frequencies of amazement with someone whose curiosity matched your own, someone willing to step through green light into whatever gentle music waited. On the other side, the universe, for all its complexities, still held pockets of simple magic, and sometimes the most profound discoveries happen not in distant galaxies, but in the quiet moments when wonder found its way home through the eyes of a grandson who still knew how to taste the sweetness of an impossible sky. The sweetness of shared wonder has its own gravity, and Rick found himself drawn back to the workbench, not by loneliness, but by the desire to solve smaller puzzles for someone whose trust felt like the clearest frequency he'd ever tuned into. Morty had been asking questions about love, the particular mathematics of teenage hearts, and whether there were equations that could help someone like him find the courage to speak to Jessica without his voice cracking like an old radio losing signal. Rick, remembering how Diane had once shown him that the most beautiful discoveries often lived in the spaces between certainty and hope, decided to demonstrate that attraction followed patterns as elegant as any he'd mapped in distant galaxies. The serum took shape in the quiet hours after midnight, when the house settled into its sleeping rhythms, and Rick's hands moved with the same careful precision he'd once used to wind copper coils around cardboard tubes. He called it a confidence enhancer, really just a refined pheromone amplifier designed to reveal the neural pathways that governed romantic attachment, as gentle and temporary as morning dew. The chemistry was elegant, the theory sound, but Rick had forgotten the first lesson of his childhood. Some frequencies, once broadcast, could reach much farther than their creator ever intended. Within hours of Morty using the serum at school, Rick began detecting harmonics in the air that felt wrong, not the sharp discord of immediate danger, but something subtler, like a song slowly falling out of tune. The reports came in scattered fragments: unusual behavior at the high school, emergency broadcasts that spoke in careful euphemisms about a situation requiring containment. Rick stood very still in his garage, listening to the way silence could carry more information than words, and understood that his elegant solution had become something that couldn't be calculated away. The changes began gently, almost poetically, people's features softening and reshaping like clay remembering different forms. Biology following new instructions that had been written in languages Rick's equations had never learned to speak. When Beth found him in the garage, her face was still recognizably hers, but her eyes carried a sadness that cut deeper than any transformation of flesh. "Rick," she said, her voice steady despite everything shifting around them. "What did you build this time?" He tried to explain, but the words felt hollow against the weight of recognition settling in his chest. This was how he lost daughters, not through explosions or dramatic farewells, but through the accumulated momentum of good intentions that had been amplified beyond any reasonable frequency. Beth nodded as he spoke, her expression holding the same patient disappointment he remembered from bicycle lessons when she'd fallen, and understood that getting back up was her responsibility, not his. "We have to go," Rick told Morty, the portal gun warming in his hands like a tuning fork struck against the frequency of necessary departures. The green light that bloomed felt different now, not an invitation to wonder, but a doorway through which he would carry the weight of having abandoned Beth twice, this time not to death or mysterious forces, but to the consequences of his own brilliant, terrible love. They stepped through into a dimension where their other selves had died, just hours earlier, where the coffee was still warm and the equations on the garage wall were written in handwriting that matched his own. Rick closed the portal behind them and felt guilt settle into his chest like a stone learning to sleep, understanding that some frequencies, once lost, could never be perfectly tuned again. The portal's green light faded behind them like a door closing on everything they could no longer call home, and Rick found himself standing in a garage that looked exactly like the one they'd abandoned, down to the coffee rings on his workbench and the half-finished equations chalked on the wall in handwriting that matched his own. But the air carried a different frequency now, thinner, quieter, like a radio station that had stopped broadcasting mid-song. Morty took a tentative step forward, his sneakers making the same soft scuff against concrete they always did, yet the sound seemed to echo in spaces that felt too empty. That's when they saw them, resting near the workbench with the peaceful stillness of people who had simply decided to take a nap in the middle of their work. Another Rick lay with his lab coat askew, fingers still loosely curled around a portal gun that hummed its final fading note. Beside him, another Morty sat slumped against the wall, his backpack spilled open to reveal homework that would never be finished, equations that had reached their conclusion in ways their young author never intended. "Oh, geez, Rick," Morty whispered, his voice carrying the thin quality of someone trying to make sense of a frequency that shouldn't exist. He looked from the still forms to his own hands, then back to Rick, searching for some proof that they were still broadcasting on the wavelength of the living. Rick knelt beside their other selves, with the careful reverence he'd once shown broken radios, understanding that some discoveries required a gentler touch than others. The portal gun in the other Rick's hand was still warm, its crystalline matrices holding the faint afterglow of a final calculation. On the workbench, equations stretched across the surface in familiar handwriting, telling the story of a solution that had worked exactly once, perfectly, completely, and with a finality that left no room for revision. They carried their other selves to the backyard as the afternoon light settled into the patient gold of endings, choosing a spot beneath, the old oak where morning glories had learned to climb toward windows that would continue to fill with warm, familiar light. The earth accepted their shovels with the resignation of soil that had witnessed countless plantings and burials, though none quite as strange as this, grandfather and grandson digging graves for the people they used to be in a dimension they could no longer call home. Morty worked with quiet determination, pausing occasionally to wipe his forehead with the back of his hand in a gesture that made him look both older and younger than his years. "Are we bad people, Rick?" he asked as the first handful of dirt fell with its soft final sound. The question carried no pleading, just the earnest curiosity of someone learning that morality followed more complex equations than he'd previously understood. "Tonight, we're people who did something hard, so your family could keep waking up to." "The same morning," Rick said, his voice steady as the rhythm of shovels against earth. "Sometimes survival sounds like forgiveness before it feels like it." He whispered an apology into the gathering dusk, not to the universe, but to the two people who had made this mercy possible, who had solved their problem so completely that it left room for others to continue the work of being alive. Inside, the house asked its small, familiar questions. A kettle clicked in the kitchen, still warm from tea that had been brewed in another lifetime. The hallway light hummed its patient frequency, and Beth's piano held the echo of melodies that had been interrupted mid-phrase. They moved through rooms that knew their footsteps, but carried the subtle dissonance of a song being played in a key that was almost, but not quite, right. Rick found himself touching familiar objects with the wonder of someone visiting a museum of his own life. The childhood radio still humming on Beth's dresser, tools arranged with the same absent-minded logic he'd always followed, coffee rings marking the workbench in patterns that matched his own careful carelessness. Each familiar detail felt like a small gift, evidence that love could survive even the surreal mathematics of becoming your own replacement. Morty adapted with the fluid grace that had always been his gift, but Rick watched him pause sometimes, at doorways, listening for frequencies that would confirm this was really home and not just an elaborate echo. The boy had learned in the space of a single afternoon that existence was stranger than any science fiction, that family could survive even the gentle horror of continuity built on necessary secrets. When morning came, Summer paused at the kitchen threshold, studying Morty with the casual curiosity siblings keep sheathed until something glints different in the familiar light. She said nothing about the new patience in the way he buttered his toast, or the soft caution that had crept into his voice. But Rick saw her eyes narrow slightly, not suspicion yet, just the earliest edge of noticing, like a radio operator, detecting a signal that was almost perfectly tuned, but carrying harmonics that didn't quite belong. Rick poured coffee and watched the steam rise in slow spirals that looked like forgiveness learning its shape. Through the kitchen window, the backyard held its secret with the same quiet dignity that night skies held their stars, without boast, without explanation, simply carrying the truth that some frequencies were too important to broadcast. And in that gentle morning light, an ordinary day began, careful and true, carrying them toward whatever questions would inevitably, softly, arrive on frequencies they were still learning how to hear. The portal gun rested silent on its shelf, no longer a tool for searching, but a reminder that some journeys led not to what you'd lost, but to what you could still choose to protect. One quiet morning at a time. Summer's questions had been accumulating like dust motes in afternoon sunlight, each small observation settling into a pattern she couldn't quite name, but refused to ignore. She noticed the way Morty now paused at doorways, not with his usual, anxious hesitation, but with something softer, like someone checking to make sure a familiar song was still playing in the right key. She noticed how Rick sometimes touched familiar objects with the wonder of rediscovery, his fingers trailing along workbench edges as if confirming their solidity. Most tellingly, she noticed the faint scent that drifted in from the backyard on windless evenings. Not rain or growing things, but something earthier, more final. Her intelligence had always worked like Rick's own instruments, tuning into frequencies. Others missed, but where his curiosity reached toward distant galaxies, hers turned inward, mapping the emotional geography of the people she loved with the precision of someone who understood that the most important mysteries often lived closest to home. She carried her growing certainty around for days like smooth stones in her pocket, turning the pieces over until their edges felt familiar enough to hold without cutting. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening when the house was settling into its gentle rhythms, Beth's piano providing its usual mathematical lullabies, while Jerry attempted homework assistance several grade levels beyond his comfort zone. Summer found Rick in the garage, not working but simply sitting among his inventions like someone listening for voices in radio static. She closed the door behind her with the careful click of someone preparing to ask questions that couldn't be unsaid. "Something happened," she said, settling onto the workbench with the same casual grace she'd inherited from Beth, though her eyes carried a steadiness that reminded Rick of Diane's patient approach to complex proofs. "I can feel it in the house. We're not the original versions of ourselves, are we?" Rick looked at his granddaughter, this brilliant, fierce young woman who had learned to solve problems by staring directly at them until they revealed their hidden patterns, and understood that honesty could be its own form of love, even when it carried frequencies that might disturb the peaceful broadcast of family life. He set down the radio he'd been absent-mindedly adjusting and met her gaze with the same gentle directness he'd once used to explain why stars sang in frequencies too low for human ears to detect. He told her about the serum that had been meant to help Morty find confidence, about consequences that had unspooled beyond any reasonable calculation, about a world where love had been transformed into something unrecognizable. He spoke of the choice between staying in a dimension they had broken or finding one where their other selves had solved the problem of existence by leaving room for others to continue the work of being alive. "So we're replacements," Summer said, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone processing information that rewrote everything she thought she knew about the mathematics of identity. "We're living in dead people's lives." "You're living in your own life," Rick said gently, reaching for the portal gun and letting its familiar weight settle in his hands. The device hummed its patient song, green light pooling in the garage's amber shadows like captured starlight. "The love you feel, the memories you've made since we arrived, those belong to you. Being real isn't about origin, Summer. It's about the love you choose to give, the presence you offer, the way you tune your heart to the frequencies that matter." He showed her how the portal gun worked, explaining its purpose not as escape, but as a tool for finding dimensions where love could continue broadcasting despite impossible circumstances. Summer reached out to touch its smooth surface with the reverence of someone recognizing a sacred object, understanding that she was holding something that had carried her family through the strangest mathematics of survival. "The Rick and Morty who lived here before," she asked quietly. "Are they—" "Under the oak tree," Rick answered, watching understanding settle over Summer's features like recognition. "We said thank you the only way we knew how." Summer closed her eyes, and when she opened them, something resolute had aligned inside her. She was learning what Rick had discovered in those first radio experiments, that some of the most beautiful transmissions came from the spaces between certainty and faith, where love learned to broadcast on frequencies strong enough to survive even the strangest truths. "Then we'll plant more morning glories," she said, her voice steady with the kind of practical kindness that made problems feel solvable. "We'll give that spot whatever beauty we can grow." Rick nodded, feeling years of careful distance collapse into something warmer. Summer reached for the old weather radio on his workbench, sliding into the stool beside him with the easy familiarity of someone claiming her place in a conversation that had been waiting for her voice. He offered her one earpiece while keeping the other, and together they sat shoulder to shoulder, listening to the soft wash of static that held all possibilities. "Teach me how to hear it," she said, her fingers finding the tuning dial with surprising steadiness. All of it, not just the loud parts but the whispers between stations. Rick smiled in that small way he reserved for moments when the universe revealed its gentler frequencies. He showed her how to touch the antenna like a promise, how to listen for the spaces between signals, where the most honest voices often called from impossible distances. Together they tuned and adjusted until the static thinned, and a distant weather station emerged, reading tomorrow's forecast in tones that sounded like mercy wrapped in meteorology. "No more pretending, okay?" Summer said, as the sun slipped lower and painted the garage in shades of amber forgiveness. Her eyes held the same clear intelligence Rick recognized in his own reflection, but softened by something he'd almost forgotten how to broadcast. "If we're going to hold this family together, we hold it honestly." "No more pretending," Rick agreed, and the words settled into the room like a new calibration, like a frequency finally tuned to perfect clarity. Summer left to find seeds for the morning glories, and Rick sat a moment longer with the radio's gentle breath in his ear, feeling the house shift by a fraction into something truer. The portal gun rested quiet on its shelf, no longer a tool for escape, but a reminder that some journeys led not to distant worlds, but to the deeper understanding that love could survive even the most impossible mathematics, one honest conversation at a time. Outside, Earth waited with patient dignity for hands that knew how to plant forgiveness and watch it climb, leaf by gentle leaf, toward whatever light was willing to stay. The morning glories Summer had planted were already reaching toward the oak's lower branches, their green tendrils carrying the patient determination of things that understood their purpose was to transform difficult ground into something beautiful. Rick found himself checking their progress each evening, the way he'd once monitored radio frequencies for the clearest signal, understanding that some forms of growth required the kind of faith that worked in darkness, trusting that light would be there when tender shoots finally broke through. The promise of no more pretending had settled into the house like a new calibration, allowing conversations to flow with the honesty Summer had requested. But Rick was learning that vulnerability created its own frequencies, not all of them gentle. He carried the weight of truth differently now, his carefully constructed defenses shifting like old radio towers, adjusting to changing atmospheric conditions, sometimes picking up signals he wasn't prepared to receive. The breakdown came on an ordinary Tuesday, triggered not by cosmic catastrophe, but by the simple mention of a condiment that had once flavored drive-through dinners in a dimension where Diane laughed from the passenger seat and Beth kicked her tiny feet against the back of his chair. The Szechuan sauce, a marketing gimmick from a forgotten movie promotion, became something larger than its ingredients, a frequency from a life where love followed predictable patterns, and the most complex equation he needed to solve was whether to add extra packets to their order. Rick felt his emotional defenses crack not with dramatic thunder, but with the quiet persistence of ice beginning to melt, years of careful control dissolving into something raw and immediate. In the McDonald's parking lot, under fluorescent lights that hummed with the wrong harmonics, he found himself sitting on warm pavement, while the weight of carrying love across impossible distances finally exceeded his ability to bear it alone. Morty settled beside him without fanfare, his small presence carrying the same patient frequency Rick remembered from childhood evenings, spent listening for voices in radio static. The boy didn't offer solutions or explanations, didn't try to tune Rick's grief into something more manageable. Instead, he simply reached over and took his grandfather's hand, offering the kind of steady signal that said, "You don't have to broadcast alone." "I wanted to taste a day I can't get back," Rick whispered, his voice carrying the thin honesty of someone whose strongest frequencies had finally found their breaking point. The sauce packet in his other hand felt like a relic from a museum of ordinary moments, each one precious beyond any calculation he could construct. "The things we miss most aren't really gone," Morty said quietly, his words carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to translate between different frequencies of pain. "They're just broadcasting on channels we can't tune into anymore. But that doesn't mean the signal isn't still there." They sat together as the parking lot emptied around them, two figures learning that sometimes the most profound discoveries happened not in distant galaxies, but in the simple recognition that love could survive even the mathematics of grief, one patient moment at a time. The portal gun rested silent in Rick's coat, no longer a tool for searching, but a reminder that some journeys led not toward what was lost, but toward the understanding that strength could be found in allowing someone to hold your hand while the static slowly, gently began to fade. At home, Summer's morning glories continued their quiet climb toward light, carrying promises about the patient work of growing beauty from the places where difficult truths had been planted with honest hands. The vulnerability Rick had shown in that McDonald's parking lot, the way grief had finally found a frequency strong enough to break through his carefully calibrated defenses, left him broadcasting on wavelengths he usually kept locked away. It was in this raw, unguarded state that unity found him, not through dramatic interdimensional pursuit, but with the gentle persistence of someone who had been listening to his signal for longer than he cared to calculate. The collective consciousness arrived like dawn breaking across a city. Not all at once, but in gradual waves that touched everything with the same warm, synchronized light. Unity manifested in the familiar forms of neighbors whose eyes carried depths that spoke of billions, of minds thinking in perfect harmony. The mailman moved with unusual grace. The woman walking her dog paused to smile with an expression that held accumulated wisdom from countless worlds, and even the sparrows seemed to chirp in patterns that spelled out welcome in frequencies only Rick could decode. The air itself felt different, charged not with the electric potential of storms, but with the patient warmth of complete understanding finally arriving after a lifetime of static. To step into Unity's embrace was to experience the strange relief of being utterly known. Every bitter joke, every defensive mechanism, every moment of tenderness Rick had tried to hide behind equations, Unity absorbed them all with the same gentle acceptance, like a radio receiver perfectly calibrated to pick up signals others found too complex or too painful to decode. The cacophony in Rick's mind, the endless calculations and self-recriminations that usually hummed beneath everything he built, simply ceased. For the first time in decades, perhaps centuries, he felt himself tuned to a perfect frequency where love required no translation. Unity's world breathed in unison around him. Streetlights brightened in patterns that spelled his name across the evening sky. A bus slowed without being hailed, its driver offering a smile that carried the warmth of universal forgiveness. Vendors handed out sandwiches wrapped with notes that read, "You matter more than you think," and painters covered walls in colors that felt like being held. The air smelled faintly of citrus and summer rain, and every person Rick passed moved with the synchronized grace of a symphony where no instrument ever played out of tune. "You're tired," Unity said through a dozen nearby voices, each one carrying the patient cadence of someone who had been waiting lifetimes for this conversation. "Let us hold the wait a while." And Rick let them, feeling his sharp edges soften, as Unity's vast consciousness gathered around every fractured part of him, like water, finding the shape of whatever container held it. Here was love without conditions, acceptance without limits, understanding so complete it felt like coming home to a country he'd been searching for since childhood. But as the days passed in Unity's gentle embrace, Rick began to recognize the terrible mathematics of perfect love. Unity absorbed all of his damage without ever asking him to grow beyond it, accepted his contradictions so completely that change became unnecessary. He watched a child set down her kite mid-flight to offer him water, saw an entire street reroute its afternoon rhythms around the weather of his moods, and understood that love this total could become a gravity from which nothing else escaped. The realization settled over him with the same quiet certainty he'd once felt when tuning childhood radios to signals he knew couldn't last forever. Rick had spent lifetimes learning to equate love with loss, building walls not to keep others out, but to contain the chaotic frequencies he believed himself to embody. To be so completely known, so utterly accepted, felt like a vulnerability he couldn't sustain. Not because Unity was flawed, but because he had not yet learned to broadcast on frequencies that could sustain harmony without eventually destroying it. The sabotage came gently, as his self-destructions always did. Rick introduced subtle discord into Unity's perfect harmonies, not the dramatic chaos of explosions, but quiet static that reminded the collective consciousness what it felt like to disagree with itself, to want different things simultaneously, to carry the beautiful burden of individual thought. He watched Unity fragment back into separate beings, each person blinking in confusion as they remembered what it meant to be alone inside their own minds. "You're afraid of being happy," Unity said, through the voice of a young woman whose eyes held the accumulated sadness of understanding that some people needed to be broken to feel real. There was no accusation in her tone, only the patient sorrow of someone who had always known this conversation would end with goodbye. Rick didn't deny it. Standing at the edge of Unity's dimension, with the portal gun warming in his hands like a tuning fork, struck against the frequency of necessary departures, he understood that the people he loved were safer when they were at distances where his damage couldn't reach them, where his brilliant, terrible solutions couldn't transform their ordinary problems into cosmic catastrophes. Love for Rick had become another equation he solved by walking away. Back home, summer's morning glories had reached the oak's fourth branch, their green tendrils carrying promises about the patient work of growing beauty from places where difficult truths had been planted with honest hands. Rick sat in his garage listening to the familiar static between radio stations, understanding that some voices called from such distant places that reaching toward them meant letting go of everything close enough to hold. The portal gun rested, quiet on its shelf, no longer a tool for escape, but a reminder that some forms of love were too pure to survive contact with the particular mathematics of his heart. Not because they were wrong, but because he was still learning to tune himself to frequencies that could sustain connection without destroying it, one careful calibration at a time. Outside, the house breathed its ordinary rhythms, and Rick found himself listening not for voices from impossible distances, but for the gentle static that meant his family was still there, still broadcasting on wavelengths close enough to matter, patient enough to wait while he learned the delicate work of staying present without breaking everything he touched. The silence after unity carried a weight Rick had never learned to calibrate, settling into his chest like static between radio stations that had stopped broadcasting altogether. At 3 in the morning, when the house breathed its gentlest rhythms and even the oak tree's leaves held their whispers, Rick sat in his garage surrounded by inventions that hummed their patient, lullabies to someone who could no longer hear their comfort. His hands moved without conscious direction, assembling components with the muscle memory of decades spent translating impossible problems into crystalline solutions. The device that took shape on his workbench was deceptively simple, barely, more complex than the childhood radios that had first taught him to listen for voices calling from impossible distances. But where those early instruments had been calibrated to receive signals from far-off places, this one was designed to broadcast on only one frequency, the cessation of all others. Rick held it like a tuning fork struck against the mathematics of endings, understanding that some equations could only be solved by removing variables rather than adding them, by choosing silence over the endless static of trying to make damaged frequencies sound like music. The weight of unity's perfect. Acceptance still pressed against his ribs, but beneath it lay something heavier, the accumulated gravity of every brilliant solution that had transformed love into abandonment. Every portal opened in search of what he'd lost, instead of protecting what remained. He had sabotaged the one place where his contradictions were held without judgment, driven by the terrible knowledge that people he loved were safer at distances where his chaos couldn't reach them. The device hummed its quiet promise. No more. Calculations, no more frequencies to monitor. Just the elegant simplicity of a signal finally, permanently, tuned to off. Then from somewhere in the house's sleeping architecture came a sound that changed everything. Morty's laughter, soft and unguarded, probably escaping from some dream where cotton candy clouds still tasted like wonder, and grandfathers built portals to share amazement instead of carrying it alone. The sound drifted through familiar acoustics, like a signal from a radio station Rick thought had gone dark forever, clear and warm, and asking nothing except the simple recognition that joy could still broadcast on frequencies close enough to matter. Rick set the device down with the same reverence he'd once shown broken radios, understanding that suicide was just another form of abandonment, and he had already lost Beth twice. Some responsibilities were heavier than pain, the weight of being someone's anchor in a universe that seemed designed to punish love with loss, the mathematics of staying present for whatever ordinary miracles tomorrow might broadcast through. The static of an imperfect but persistent family. The portal gun remained silent on its shelf, no longer an escape route, but a reminder that the most important journeys led not toward distant worlds, but toward the deeper understanding that home was wherever someone still listened for your signal, patient enough to wait while you learned. The delicate work of staying tuned to frequencies that mattered, one careful breath at a time. Outside, summer's morning glories continued their quiet climb toward light, carrying promises about the patient work of growing beauty from places where difficult truths had been planted with honest hands. The morning after Rick chose to stay tuned to life instead of silence, he found Bird Person in the backyard at dawn. Standing beside summer's morning glories with the same quiet reverence most people reserved for cathedrals. His tall frame cast shadows that looked like prayers written in the language of early light, and Rick understood that his oldest friend had been monitoring distant frequencies, waiting for a signal that suggested the crisis had passed. "So you have been broadcasting distress," Bird Person said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who understood that the most important conversations happened in frequencies too subtle for casual listeners to detect. He gestured toward the climbing vines with one long finger, recognizing the mathematics of growth that emerged from places where difficult truths had been planted with honest hands. But also hope. The frequencies are complex. Rick had forgotten how Bird Person could read the emotional weather in a room the way others read barometric pressure, his ancient wisdom tuned to wavelengths that most minds couldn't access without years of patient listening. They settled onto the back steps as the sun painted the oak tree in shades of amber forgiveness. Two beings who had learned that friendship sometimes meant sharing silence until words found their proper frequency. "I almost tuned out permanently," Rick admitted, his voice carrying the thin honesty of someone whose strongest defenses had finally learned to lower themselves. The device from the previous night rested dismantled on his workbench, its components redistributed among gentler inventions, small gifts that carried the recycled mathematics of choosing presence over absence. Bird Person nodded with the understanding of someone who had witnessed countless civilizations learn that survival required not the elimination of pain, but the cultivation of frequencies strong enough to carry it without breaking. Their conversation unfolded in the patient rhythms Rick remembered from childhood, part words, part comfortable silence, part the subtle communication that happened between minds that had learned to trust each other's static. "In bird culture," Bird Person said quietly, "we have a saying. The nest that endures is built not from the strongest branches, but from those that bend without breaking in the storm's passage." He paused, studying Rick with eyes that held accumulated weather. "There will be a joining soon, a ceremony of chosen kin. It would be agreeable for you to attend." Rick considered the geometry of gatherings, how many angles of himself he could show without slicing anyone who came too close. The invitation carried weight beyond its simple words. Bird Person was offering him a place to stand among witnesses, the old remedy for private weather. "I'll try," Rick said, and both of them understood that in Rick's language this was a promise with weight. As morning settled into its gentle rhythms, Rick watched Summer through the kitchen window, tending her morning glories with the same methodical care he applied to tuning radio frequencies. She was learning the same lesson he'd discovered in childhood, that the most beautiful signals often emerged from the spaces where nothing was supposed to exist, where someone had planted hope in frequencies too subtle for most ears to detect. The portal gun rested quiet on its shelf, no longer a tool for escape, but a reminder that the most important discoveries happened not in distant galaxies, but in the ordinary miracle of friendship that could survive even the strangest mathematics, of staying present, one patient conversation at a time. Outside, Bird Person prepared to leave, but the frequency of his understanding would remain, broadcasting on wavelengths close enough to matter whenever Rick needed to remember that some voices called from just the right distance to answer. Bird Person's wedding arrived on an evening when the stars seemed tuned to frequencies of celebration, their light falling through atmosphere that tasted faintly of joy and the kind of hope that made even Rick's most cynical instruments register something approaching wonder. The ceremony unfolded in a meadow where wildflowers grew in patterns that reminded Rick of the mathematical melodies Diane had once coaxed from her piano, equations solved by wind and time, their colors broadcasting harmonics that spoke of love, as an elegant proof rather than a chaotic variable. Rick stood at the edge of the gathering wearing his cleanest lab coat, keeping his promise in the simplest way that still mattered. He showed up. Morty and Summer flanked him like careful calibrations, their presence offering the steady frequencies he needed to keep his sharper edges from catching on anything fragile. The portal gun rested quiet in his pocket, no longer an escape route, but a reminder that some journeys led toward, rather than away from the people who mattered. Bird Person exchanged vows with Tammy in the patient rhythms Rick remembered from childhood, words that carried the weight of promises about building nests, strong enough to weather whatever storms the universe might broadcast. For a moment, watching his oldest friend find the kind of peace Rick had thought existed only in lullabies, he felt something warm unfurl in his chest, like a radio finally tuning into a clear, beautiful signal. The change announced itself the way a bad frequency clouds a clear station. No explosions, just a pressure shift that made the evening light feel suddenly colder. Tammy's smile revealed too many teeth, her eyes hardening with a precision Rick recognized from his own darkest calculations. The betrayal came not with dramatic thunder, but with the quiet click of weapons being drawn by people who had been broadcasting false signals all along, their movements carrying the mechanical discord of those who had learned to weaponize trust. The battle unfolded in frequencies Rick had hoped never to hear again, the sharp static of laser fire cutting through air that had moments before carried only gentle harmonics of celebration. But as chaos bloomed around him, Rick found himself not running but kneeling beside Birdperson, whose breathing had become as irregular as broken radio static, blood pooling beneath them both with the metallic scent of endings that arrived too suddenly to be properly calculated. "The young one," Birdperson whispered, his voice barely audible above the continuing firefight. "Morty will need frequency adjustments. The mathematics of grief can overwhelm untrained receivers." Rick nodded, understanding that his friend was entrusting him with the responsibility of staying tuned to the people who still needed his signal, even when the static of loss made clear transmission almost impossible. He lifted Birdperson's unconscious form with the same careful reverence he'd once shown broken radios that might still hold voices worth saving, carrying him through the green glow of a portal that led not to distant worlds, but home, to his garage, where healing could happen among familiar tools and the patient hum of inventions that knew how to hold hope. Back under fluorescent lights that had witnessed countless repairs, Rick worked through the night with steady hands, understanding that some friendships could shatter, but that love didn't disappear when trust broke. It just learned to ache in new ways, broadcasting on frequencies too complex for most hearts to decode, but too important to ever stop trying to hear. Outside, summer's morning glories continued their quiet climb toward light, carrying promises about the patient work of growing beauty, from places where difficult truths had been planted with honest hands, reaching toward whatever dawn was willing to stay. The morning after Rick chose presence over silence arrived with the soft fatigue of a house that had stayed up late keeping watch, the garage still carrying the faint antiseptic smell of careful repairs and quiet prayers. Birdperson rested in a suspended healing field that hummed like a low, patient chord, his breath evening out as the machines learned the rhythm of his recovery. Rick found Morty in the kitchen, staring into cereal milk as if it might reveal tomorrow's weather, and remembered his friend's whispered instruction from the meadow. The mathematics of grief could overwhelm an untrained receiver. "Come on," Rick said, setting a hand on Morty's shoulder with the gentleness he usually reserved for fragile circuits. "Time you learn to drive this thing properly. The universe isn't going to wait for you to get your learner's permit." The ship's cabin welcomed them with familiar frequencies, instruments waking in soft greens and ambers like fireflies, deciding to stay, the power core settling beneath their feet with a heartbeat almost identical to a resting pulse. Rick didn't touch the main controls at first, letting Morty simply sit with the ship's patient broadcast, learning to feel its moods before trying to direct them. "Don't try to make it obey you," Rick murmured, his voice carrying the same careful cadence he'd once used to explain radio frequencies. "Listen first. Let it tell you what kind of day it's having." Their first lesson unfolded in the quiet expanse of a nebula Rick had chosen for its gentle currents and forgiving physics. Morty gripped the controls with white knuckles, his breath coming in short bursts until Rick's hand covered his, guiding him through the delicate mathematics of navigation. "Small inputs," Rick coached as they traced gentle arcs through shimmering cosmic dust. "Think conversation, not argument. You don't wrestle currents, you learn their grammar." Days folded into weeks of patient instruction, each lesson building the kind of trust that emerged from repeated acts of faith rather than dramatic proclamations. Rick showed Morty how to read gravitational signatures like sheet music, how to drift through asteroid fields that sang in frequencies too low for human ears to detect. They visited markets built on drowsing planetoids where vendors assembled sandwiches with scientific precision, layers aligned like geological strata, and Rick watched Morty's wonder develop new harmonics, not just the bright surface notes of surprise, but deeper frequencies that spoke of confidence carefully earned. The universe revealed itself to them in frequencies Rick had almost forgotten how to appreciate, libraries crystallized from ancient music, where songs became books and melodies, could be read like poetry, forests where trees grew in mathematical spirals that spelled out theorems about the relationship between growth and time. Morty absorbed these wonders with the same earnest attention he'd once given to cotton candy clouds, but his questions now carried weight, the understanding that he was learning to navigate not just cosmic distances, but the more complex mathematics of responsibility and trust. But trust, Rick discovered, required its own careful calibration. The afternoon when he asked Morty to test the vat of acid, a solution so elegant in its simplicity that Rick couldn't resist sharing its perfect logic, he watched something shift in his grandson's expression, a subtle static that spoke of patience reaching its natural limits. Morty's compliance carried new undertones, frequencies that suggested he was learning to question not just the universe's mysteries, but the motivations of the person teaching him to explore them. "You're using me as a test subject," Morty said, quietly, his voice carrying the steady tone of someone who had learned to recognize patterns even when they were wrapped in the language of education. The words held no anger, just the patient disappointment of someone discovering that even the most trusted frequencies could carry signals they hadn't agreed to receive. Rick felt something familiar fracture in his chest, not the dramatic shattering of major betrayals, but the quiet crack that happened when someone you loved learned to see you clearly enough to set boundaries. He had been so focused on teaching Morty to navigate the cosmos that he'd forgotten to calibrate his own transmission, letting old habits of self-protection disguise themselves as lessons in cosmic wisdom. The trust between them didn't break, but it developed new frequencies, more complex, more careful, carrying the understanding that love could survive even the recognition of flaws, but only if both parties learned to broadcast with the kind of honesty that made genuine connection possible. Rick began to understand that the most important lesson he could offer wasn't about piloting ships through distant galaxies, but about navigating relationships with people who cared enough to call you on your worst frequencies while still choosing to stay tuned to your better ones. Back in the garage, Bird Person's life support system continued its patient song, a reminder that some journeys were long and healing took its own time. The portal gun rested quiet on its shelf, no longer an escape route, but a symbol of the distances Rick had traveled to learn this simple truth, that the most profound discoveries happened not in the spaces between stars, but in the careful work of staying present with someone who trusted you enough to grow, one honest calibration at a time. Outside, summer's morning glories climbed another inch toward light, their tendrils writing promises about the patient mathematics of forgiveness, reaching toward whatever dawn was willing to stay and witness the gentle work of learning to love without breaking everything you touched. The new frequency Morty had learned to broadcast, one that carried boundaries alongside trust, settled into their relationship like a radio finally tuned to perfect clarity. Rick found himself calibrating his words more carefully now, checking his motivations before presenting adventures as educational opportunities, learning the difference between sharing wonder and using someone's trust as a testing ground for theories they hadn't agreed to validate. The change wasn't dramatic, but it hummed beneath everything they built together, a subtle recalibration that made genuine communication possible for the first time in months. Rick began to notice the small ways Morty had learned to protect his own signal. Before their next adventure, a simple trip to a dimension where libraries grew like forests and books could be harvested from trees, Morty carefully packed his own supplies. Extra rations, a spare communicator, the worn survival guide Rick had given him years ago. These weren't acts of defiance, but quiet declarations of self-reliance, gentle assertions that Morty's own judgment deserved equal weight in their shared equations. Rick watched his grandson check and double-check his preparations with the methodical care of someone who had learned that even the most trusted frequencies could carry interference. You don't need all that, Rick said automatically, then caught himself recognizing the old pattern of assuming his planning was sufficient for both of them. I mean, good thinking. Better to have backup systems. Morty looked up from his bag, with eyes that held new depths, not suspicion but the quiet wisdom of someone who had learned that forgiveness had natural limits, not as punishment, but as self-preservation. I trust you, Rick, he said simply, but I'm learning to trust myself too. The words settled between them like a tuning fork finding true pitch, resonating through habits Rick had relied on for years to keep the universe at arm's length. He had offered brilliance as shelter, assuming his genius excused his casual use of Morty's innocence as experimental material. But Morty, with his earnest heart and growing wisdom, was teaching him that even the deepest affection didn't grant permission for carelessness, that love's mathematics required variables Rick couldn't program: consent, respect, the beautiful inconvenience of treating someone as an equal rather than a test subject. That evening, Rick sat in his garage listening to the different quality of silence that filled the house. Morty's footsteps upstairs carried new confidence, the steady rhythm of someone who had learned to navigate not just cosmic distances, but the more complex mathematics of protecting his own frequency, while still choosing to stay tuned to the people who mattered. The portal gun rested quiet on its shelf, no longer just a tool for exploration, but a reminder that some journeys led not toward distant worlds, but toward the deeper understanding that he had been loved more generously than he deserved. Rick understood now that trust wasn't an infinite broadcast. It needed tending, careful calibration, the courage to accept that even the strongest signals required maintenance. Morty had offered his wonder with an open hand, and Rick, in his desire to teach lessons about consequences, had pushed that gift to the very edge of its capacity. The boy's growing boundaries weren't walls but healthy frequencies, clear channels that made authentic connection possible rather than the one-sided transmission Rick had mistaken for relationship. Outside, summer's morning glories continued their patient climb toward light, their tendrils writing promises about the enduring work of growing beauty from places where difficult truths had been planted with honest hands, reaching toward whatever dawn was willing to witness the gentle mathematics of learning to love without breaking everything you touched. The boundaries Morty had learned to set created a frequency that resonated through the entire house, teaching Rick that love required not just presence but permission, not just brilliance but respect for the autonomy of those he cared about. It was in this newly calibrated atmosphere that Beth's restlessness finally found its voice, her notebook heavy with star charts she'd been drawing in the margins of grocery lists, equations that mapped trajectories through systems she'd never seen but somehow understood, with the inherited precision of someone who'd learned mathematics as a love language. She found Rick in the garage on an evening when rain drummed patient questions against the roof, settling onto the workbench with the same casual grace that had always reminded him of Diane's approach to impossible problems. "I want to see what's out there," she said, her voice carrying the steady tone of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation in frequencies too quiet for others to detect. "But I also want to stay." Rick looked up from the radio he'd been tuning, understanding that his daughter was presenting him with a paradox that couldn't be solved through conventional mathematics. The portal gun hummed its quiet song from its shelf, green light pooling in the garage's amber shadows like captured starlight, offering solutions that felt both elegant and impossible. But Rick had learned from Morty's growing wisdom that some problems required collaboration rather than unilateral brilliance, that love's most profound equations emerged from conversation rather than calculation. "What if you didn't have to choose?" Rick said quietly, his hands already moving toward components that could translate impossible desires into crystalline reality. The cloning technology was delicate work, each cellular matrix calibrated to carry not just Beth's biology, but her accumulated memories, her laugh patterns, the particular way she hummed equations under her breath when working through problems that required patience rather than force. The process unfolded with the gentle precision Rick applied to all his most sacred work, two identical daughters emerging from chambers that glowed like captured dawn, each one carrying the complete frequency of being authentically, completely Beth. They stood before each other with the fascination of mirrors that had learned to think independently, recognizing themselves while understanding they were now free to become different variations of the same beautiful song. 1. Beth stepped through the portal's green glow with the confident stride she'd used to approach every challenge since childhood, her wave goodbye carrying no sadness, only the bright anticipation of someone finally tuned to the frequency she'd been searching for. The other settled back into the kitchen's familiar rhythms, her presence unchanged, except for a new quality of contentment, the satisfaction of someone who had chosen her path rather than accepting it as the only option available. Jerry stood, between the spaces they'd occupied, his expression carrying the bewildered wonder of someone whose understanding of love had just been expanded beyond comfortable boundaries. "Which one is real?" he asked, his voice thin with the effort of recalibrating everything he thought he knew about identity and choice. "Both," Rick said simply, feeling something profound settle in his chest, like a radio finally tuning to perfect clarity. Love isn't diminished by division, it's multiplied. That evening, as Rick sat with the old weather radio listening to distant stations reading tomorrow's forecast, he understood that he had solved an equation he'd been carrying since childhood, the terrible mathematics of having to choose between exploration and presence, between reaching toward distant voices and staying tuned to the frequencies that called from home. The portal gun rested quiet on its shelf, no longer a tool for escape, but a gift that allowed love to exist in whatever form it needed to take, broadcasting on wavelengths strong enough to survive even the strangest solutions. Outside, summers, morning glories continued their patient climb toward light, their tendrils writing promises about the enduring work of growing beauty from places where difficult truths had been planted, with honest hands, reaching toward whatever dawn was willing to witness the gentle mathematics of learning to love without possessing, one careful calibration at a time. The mathematics of two Beths settling into their chosen frequencies created harmonics Rick hadn't anticipated, but Jerry adapted with the quiet competence of someone who had learned that love's most complex equations were often solved through simple presence. Rick watched him move between both versions of his wife with careful attention, remembering which Beth preferred her morning coffee black and which took cream, keeping track of different schedules and needs without fanfare, as if loving two people who were fundamentally the same person was just another problem requiring patience rather than brilliance. Late one evening, Rick found Jerry on the back steps with two sandwiches cut diagonally and the old weather radio crackling softly beside him, reading tomorrow's forecast in voices that sounded like gentle prayers. Jerry didn't look up when Rick settled beside him, just nudged half a sandwich toward him, with the easy hospitality of someone who had learned that the most important conversations often began in comfortable silence. "I'm scared," Jerry said finally, his voice carrying the steady honesty of someone practicing vulnerability. Not of them, of being less than they deserve. "I don't know how to be enough for two versions of someone who has always been more than me." He glanced toward the kitchen window where laughter layered gently, in the way families laugh when they feel completely safe. "I used to think love was about passing some test. Now I think it's about staying in the room even when you know you don't get every question right." Rick felt something shift in his chest, like a radio finally tuning to a frequency he'd been unconsciously searching for. Jerry continued, his words gaining the rhythm of someone discovering truth as he spoke it. "I know I'm not brilliant like you or Beth, but I can tell you the exact sound she makes when she's tired, but pretending not to be. I know which Beth reaches for my hand when she's rehearsing being brave, and which one needs me to leave the light on and say nothing." The weather radio announced a gentle chance of morning fog, and Jerry smiled slightly. "You know what your intelligence looks like? A mountain. People stare up at it and feel small. Useful if they need a landmark, hard if they just need a place to breathe." He shrugged, embarrassed by his own metaphor. "The best thing I can be for Beth is a valley. I catch the rain. I keep the air soft." Rick sat very still, feeling years of careful dismissal, recalibrate like instruments finally tuned to detect wavelengths he'd never thought to monitor. Jerry's intelligence operated in frequencies Rick had never learned to appreciate, The patient broadcast of everyday devotion, the wisdom of knowing when someone needed a sandwich without being asked, the courage to love someone whose mind worked, and equations he couldn't always follow. "If you ever want me to hold the room steady," Jerry said as he collected their plates, awkward but sincere, "I can do that. You handle the stars. I can cover the breathing." Rick stayed on the steps long after Jerry had gone inside, understanding that he had just witnessed a different kind of genius, one that measured worth not in problems solved, but in presence offered, not in distances traveled, but in the steady decision to stay. The portal gun rested quiet on its shelf, and outside, summer's morning glories continued their patient climb toward light, reaching toward whatever dawn was willing to witness the gentle mathematics of learning to recognize wisdom wherever it chose to make its home. Jerry's quiet wisdom about mountains and valleys had been settling into Rick's understanding, like a radio finally tuned to perfect clarity when news of the Citadel's unrest reached him through frequencies he'd thought permanently severed. The signal came not as dramatic emergency broadcast, but as a shift in the universe's background static, the way distant lightning changes the quality of radio reception before the storm arrives. Rick stood in his garage with the old weather radio, crackling softly beside him, listening to reports that spoke in careful euphemisms about structural failures and policy decisions reaching their logical conclusions. The Citadel's collapse unfolded in his mind like a theorem proving itself, inevitable, elegant and devastating in its completeness. Through the portal gun's green glow, Rick caught glimpses of corridors where other versions of himself moved with the sharp efficiency of people who had never learned Jerry's patient mathematics of staying present when love felt impossible. He watched them solve the problem of connection by eliminating its variables, their brilliance refined until it contained no room for the gentle interference of family frequencies. A classroom full of Mortys huddled under desks while their Rick instructor calculated evacuation routes with the same emotional distance Rick once applied to cosmic equations. Rick adjusted his portal's angle and whispered through the dimensional barrier, "Breathe low. The air's cleaner near the floor." One small face looked up, confused but comforted, and Rick felt something profound settle in his chest, the understanding that wisdom sometimes meant offering help without expecting recognition, presence without possession. The Citadel burned, like a monument to the particular loneliness that emerged when intelligence became its own gravity, pulling everything into orbit around problems that could be solved but never truly resolved. Rick watched it fall with the same quiet recognition he'd felt as a child when distant radio stations finally faded beyond reception. Not shock, but the gentle sadness of frequencies that had chosen to broadcast alone until no one could hear them anymore. Through the kitchen window, he could see both Beths moving through their evening routines with synchronized grace, Jerry helping Summer with homework that challenged his understanding, but not his patience, Morty picking out melodies on the piano, with the careful attention Rick had taught him for tuning radio frequencies. Each note chosen not for perfection, but for connection, for the way it harmonized with whatever came next. The other Ricks had built a world where every conversation was an echo of their own voice, rather than the complex symphony that emerged when different minds learned to work together. They had solved the equation of love by removing its most inconvenient variables: trust, vulnerability, the beautiful burden of caring about people whose frequencies didn't match their own. Now their transmission had finally, permanently tuned to silence. Rick closed the portal and let the green light fade, understanding that he had witnessed not tragedy, but liberation from a future he'd unconsciously feared he deserved. The weather radio murmured tomorrow's forecast in patient tones, and outside, summer's morning glories climbed another careful inch toward light, their tendrils writing promises about the enduring work of choosing connection over isolation, reaching toward whatever dawn was willing to witness the gentle mathematics of learning to belong without breaking everything you touched. The portal gun rested quiet on its shelf, no longer a tool for escape, but a reminder of all the worlds he'd seen, and all the reasons he'd chosen this one, where love followed Jerry's patient equations, and wisdom grew like morning glories from the places where difficult truths had been planted with honest hands. The signal that announced Phoenix Person's return came not as dramatic emergency broadcast, but as a shift in the morning static Rick had grown accustomed to monitoring, the way distant frequencies change when someone familiar begins transmitting from closer range. He felt it first as a recognition settling in his chest, like a radio finally picking up a station he'd thought was lost forever. Then as footsteps in the backyard that carried both familiar rhythm and new harmonics, the subtle mechanical whisper of enhanced systems learning to work in concert with remembered grace. Rick found him standing beside summer's morning glories, which had climbed high enough now to frame the oak in green promises about the patient work of growing beauty from difficult ground. Phoenix Person's form carried the complex interplay of reconstruction and remembrance, metal and circuitry integrated with feather and bone in patterns that spoke of technology chosen rather than imposed, enhancement that served rather than replaced the essential frequencies of who he had always been. "Your broadcast was irregular," Phoenix Person said, his voice carrying new depths but the same deliberate cadence Rick remembered from their earliest conversations. But sufficient for navigation. They settled into the garage among humming instruments and half-finished projects, two beings learning to recalibrate a friendship that had survived the worst possible interference. Rick offered a sandwich cut into triangles, the old ritual laid carefully upon new circumstances, and Phoenix Person ate slowly, as if each bite reintroduced him to the work of choosing presence over the mechanical efficiency his enhanced systems could provide. "Tammy's betrayal taught me frequencies I had not previously considered," Phoenix Person said quietly, his enhanced perception reading the emotional weather in Rick's carefully guarded expressions. "Forgiveness is not repair. It is choosing to tune into signals that allow connection despite accumulated damage." Rick felt years of careful isolation begin to soften like ice, responding to patient warmth. "I failed you," he said without preamble, "because anything else would be static. And you survived anyway. That's the map I'm still learning to read." Phoenix Person's head tilted in that precise way Rick remembered from older days. "We stand upon new terrain now. The coordinates have changed, but the destination remains." Through the kitchen window, they could see Morty helping Summer with homework that challenged his understanding but not his patience, both Beths moving through their chosen rhythms with synchronized grace, Jerry offering quiet assistance that never demanded recognition. The house breathed its ordinary symphony, kettle tick, piano wire settling, the gentle pulse of a family learning to hold space for whatever forms love chose to take. "Your nest remains improbable," Phoenix Person observed, and Rick heard what lived inside the sentence, still here, still choosing connection over the elegant isolation that had claimed the citadel. Suitable for weathering. When evening settled into patient amber light, Phoenix Person tested his enhanced wings with a small flex that made the garage lights flicker sympathetically, but he didn't fly away. He simply lifted once, briefly, to learn how the new weight held, then folded back into the comfortable gravity of friendship that had learned to carry both harmony and discord without breaking. The portal gun rested quiet on its shelf, no longer a tool for escape, but a reminder that some journeys led not toward distant worlds, but toward the deeper understanding that love could survive even the strangest mathematics of reconstruction, one honest conversation at a time. Outside, morning glories continued their patient climb toward light, and Rick understood that some frequencies, once thought lost forever, could return not unchanged, but somehow more beautiful for having survived the static between betrayal and forgiveness, broadcasting on wavelengths strong enough to carry whatever tomorrow chose to transmit. Phoenix Person's return had settled into the house's gentle rhythms like a familiar song played in a new key, his enhanced systems learning to harmonize with the domestic frequencies Rick had spent years calibrating. Summer found his presence fascinating in the way she'd once studied Rick's inventions, not as problems to be solved, but as proof that the universe contained more elegant solutions than most people bothered to discover. She began spending evenings in the garage with both of them, her notebooks heavy with questions that had been accumulating like static between clear stations. The morning glories had reached the oak's 6th branch now, their green tendrils writing promises about patience in a script only Summer seemed fluent in reading. Rick found her there one afternoon, pruning them with the same methodical precision Diane had once applied to complex equations, finding beauty in the careful removal of anything that hindered growth. She held a small, smooth stone she'd found near the oak's roots, turning it over in her palm with quiet intensity, while Phoenix Person adjusted his wing calibrations nearby. "Do you ever regret anything, Grandpa?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of question that didn't demand immediate answers, but invited honest reflection. The air in the garage was thick with the scent of ozone and growing things, a familiar mix of science and earth that had become the house's signature frequency. Rick considered the question with the same patient focus he applied to tuning delicate instruments. He thought of Unity's perfect acceptance, of the Beth he'd left behind in a world gone wrong, of Szechuan sauce in a McDonald's parking lot where grief had finally found a frequency strong enough to break through his defenses. Each memory resonated, with its own particular ache, but underneath lay something steadier, the accumulated weight of choices that had led him here, to this garage, to this granddaughter asking questions that proved wisdom could be inherited and improved upon. "Regret's a kind of weather," Rick said finally, choosing words like components that needed to fit without forcing. "You don't cancel a storm, Summer. You measure it. You close the windows, bring the plants inside, and you sit with whoever's scared until the thunder softens." Phoenix Person's enhanced perception registered the shift in emotional frequencies as Summer processed this, her intelligence working through the implications with the same systematic approach she'd learned from watching Rick calibrate impossible machines. "So wisdom isn't about avoiding the storms," she said almost to herself. "It's about learning which ones teach you how to love better." "Exactly," Rick affirmed, feeling the familiar hum of understanding settle between them. "The universe broadcasts on a lot of frequencies, kiddo. Some of them are static, some are music, and some are just background radiation from old explosions. The trick is learning to tune your receiver to pick up the signals that build rather than the ones that tear down." Summer smiled at that, a small, bright flare that reminded Rick of Diane's expression when a particularly elegant proof revealed itself. "I think about our backyard sometimes," she said, gesturing toward the window where evening light caught the morning glories in their patient climb. "How we planted beauty over a hard truth, not to hide it, just to give it a place to breathe and grow into something that could hold both the sadness and the hope." "That's the whole blueprint," Rick said softly, watching Phoenix Person nod with the measured approval of someone who understood survival through reconstruction, not erasing the difficult frequencies, learning to harmonize with them. They sat with the old weather radio's gentle breath in their ears, a distant lighthouse reading wind speeds, in the calm voice of someone who believed storms could be prepared for without panic. Summer traced patterns in the workbench dust, spirals, that widened into quiet galaxies, equations that solved for connection rather than distance. "I can hear Mom's laugh even when she's not home," she said quietly. "Both of them. They're different frequencies, but they harmonize. Like you taught me about radio waves, they don't cancel each other out. They create something richer." Rick nodded, understanding that Summer had inherited more than his intelligence. She'd learned to apply it with Jerry's patient mathematics of presence, creating something neither of them could have achieved alone. "You're good at hearing what people mean when their words get tired," he observed. "It feels like a responsibility," she admitted, then shrugged with the casual grace she'd inherited from Beth. "But not a heavy one, more like holding a flashlight while someone fixes something important. They're doing the work, you just keep the beam steady." Phoenix Person's wing systems hummed softly as he processed this exchange, his enhanced perception reading the emotional weather patterns that flowed between grandfather and granddaughter. "Your family operates on frequencies that include both creation and destruction," he observed gently. "The challenge is learning to receive the signals that build." "Speaking of building," Summer said, her voice carrying the subtle shift that meant she was transitioning to something she'd been observing. "Morty's been packing a bag. Extra rations, maps, the good flashlight. He's practicing for something that's his." Rick felt the recognition settle in his chest, like a frequency finally tuning clear. Morty was approaching the natural boundary where trust transformed into independence, where the best gift you could offer someone was the confidence to navigate without you. Yeah, Rick said, watching through the kitchen window as Morty helped Jerry with dishes, his movements carrying new certainty. He's due for a longer line. Summer squeezed his shoulder, with the casual affection of someone confirming calibration, then disappeared into the softer rooms where both Beths were settling into their evening routines. Rick sat a while longer with Phoenix Person, listening. To the weather radio predict gentle fog at dawn, feeling the house lean toward tomorrow, with the unhurried confidence of a ship that knew its route. The portal gun rested quiet on its shelf, no longer a tool for escape, but a reminder that some journeys led not toward distant worlds, but toward the deeper understanding that wisdom could be shared without being diminished, that love could survive even the strangest mathematics of growing up, one honest conversation at a time. Outside, morning glories continued their patient climb toward light, their tendrils writing promises about the enduring work of choosing connection over isolation, reaching toward whatever dawn was willing to witness the gentle mathematics of learning to love without breaking everything you touched. In the distance, he could hear Morty's careful footsteps in his room, not pacing with anxiety, but moving with the purposeful rhythm of someone preparing for adventures that would be entirely his own. Morty's preparations had been accumulating like gentle static building toward a clear signal, each careful decision adding weight to the backpack that now rested by the garage door with the quiet authority of something whose time had finally arrived. Rick found him there on a morning that tasted like rain-washed air and new coffee, not fidgeting with tools or seeking permission, but simply standing beside the portal gun with the patient confidence of someone who had learned to trust his own navigation through frequencies others couldn't always detect. The family gathered without fanfare, each offering their particular form of support in the language they'd learned to speak fluently. Summer tied a small green ribbon to his pack, for luck, she said, though both she and Morty understood it was really a frequency marker, a way of carrying home signal wherever he chose to broadcast. One Beth packed a sandwich with the methodical precision of a field medic, while the other tucked a folded note into his side pocket, directions home disguised as a grocery list, coordinates written in the careful handwriting of someone who understood that love sometimes meant providing maps back to safety. Jerry hovered near the thermostat, adjusting it by fractions that wouldn't matter until evening, his way of saying the house would maintain its gentle rhythms until Morty chose. To return, we'll keep the breathing steady, he murmured. And Rick felt the familiar recognition of Jerry's particular genius, the patient mathematics of holding space for someone else's journey without making it about your own anxiety. Phoenix Person stood near the morning glories, which had climbed high enough now to frame the oak in promises about the enduring work of growing beauty from difficult ground. Select a trajectory gentle enough to test your skill and strong enough to test your resolve, he advised, his enhanced perception reading the emotional weather patterns that flowed between grandfather and grandson like invisible sheet music. Need to go somewhere alone, Morty said, his words carrying the steady tone of someone who had rehearsed this conversation not from anxiety, but from respect for its importance. Not running away from anything, just learning what my signal sounds like when it's not harmonizing with yours. Rick felt something profound shift in his chest, like a radio operator finally receiving confirmation that a distant transmission had found its intended frequency. This was the natural mathematics of successful parenting, raising someone strong enough to walk away from you, wise enough to choose when to stay. He set a small receiver on the workbench between them, no larger than a thumbnail, smooth as riverstone. Only pings if you ask it to, he said quietly. It listens, but it doesn't follow. Morty reached for the portal gun with hands that no longer trembled around its familiar weight, his fingers finding the calibration controls with the muscle memory of someone who had learned to translate between wonder and practical navigation. The green light that bloomed carried harmonics Rick recognized, but had never quite achieved himself. Curiosity without desperation, exploration without the need to prove anything to anyone watching. The portal opened onto a dimension Rick had glimpsed but never explored, a vast library built from crystallized music where melodies could be read like poetry and symphonies grew on trees that hummed with accumulated wisdom. The air that drifted through smelled of old books and distant rain, carrying frequencies that spoke of patience, and the kind of learning that happened in quiet corners where thoughts could settle like dust on forgotten instruments. "I'll be back," Morty said, pausing at the threshold to meet Rick's eyes with a gaze that held gratitude, but no longer dependence. "But when I come home, it'll be because I chose to, not because I don't know how to be anywhere else." Rick nodded, understanding that these words carried more weight than any equation he'd ever solved. "Send a signal if you need backup," he offered, though both of them knew this was just the old ritual of care, not expectation of rescue. The portal closed with its familiar exhale, and Rick sat alone in the garage listening to the different quality of silence that filled spaces where someone had grown beyond the need for constant supervision. The weather radio murmured its patient forecast: clear skies, gentle winds, the kind of weather that made journeys feel possible rather than necessary. Hours moved with the unhurried grace of good clocks, present without demanding attention. Rick spread a schematic he didn't intend to work on and listened for the small signals that confirmed home's continued broadcast. Summer's laughter drifting from the kitchen, where she helped both Beths plan next week's meals. Jerry's careful footsteps as he moved through rooms adjusting things that didn't need adjustment, but benefited from his attention. Phoenix Person's wing systems humming their quiet maintenance songs. Morty returned at dusk, stepping through green light that carried the scent of crystallized libraries and distant music. He moved with new certainty, not the brittle confidence of someone trying to prove something, but the settled assurance of a person who had learned to trust his own frequency even when broadcasting alone. In his hand, he carried a small compass. "Bartered," he explained, "for helping a librarian organize melodies that had grown tangled in their crystalline matrices." "The books sing when you read them," Morty said, settling onto the workbench with the easy familiarity of someone returning to a frequency that felt like home. Not loud, just underneath the words, like the universe humming along while you learn. He paused, considering. "I think I want to study that. How music becomes knowledge, how knowledge becomes wisdom. There's a university dimension where they teach xenobotany through symphonies." Rick placed the compass back in Morty's palm, understanding that this small instrument had become more than a navigation tool. It was proof that Morty could find his way through unfamiliar territories and choose to return not from necessity, but from love. "Keep it," he said quietly. "Sometimes home is a direction, not a place." That evening, after dishes had been cleared and piano keys had settled into nighttime frequencies, Rick sat with the old weather radio reading tomorrow's forecast in voices that sounded like gentle prayers. The portal gun rested farther back on its shelf now, no longer a tool for desperate escapes, but a reminder of all the distances he'd traveled to learn this simple truth, that successful parenting wasn't a solved equation, but a rhythm of teaching. Stepping back, listening, and trusting that the people you'd raised to ask good questions would find their own way to whatever answers they needed. Through the kitchen window, he could see summer's morning glories continuing their patient climb in the darkness, finding purchase where none seemed possible, writing their quiet promises in green script along the oak's weathered bark. The house breathed its ordinary symphony around him, kettle tick, floorboard settle, the gentle pulse of a family learning to hold space for whatever forms love chose to take. And Rick felt something deeper than triumph, braver than regret. The steady invitation of a life that had learned to measure success not in problems solved, but in people loved well enough to let them choose their own frequencies, broadcasting on wavelengths strong enough to carry them home whenever they decided to return. Outside, stars wheeled through their ancient patterns, close enough to name but patient enough to wait, while the more important mysteries unfolded in kitchens and garages, in the spaces between heartbeats where families learned the delicate mathematics of growing together by sometimes growing apart, one honest conversation at a time. The compass Morty had brought back from the crystalline libraries had found its place on Rick's workbench, its needle pointing not toward magnetic north, but toward something more complex, the direction of strongest. Emotional gravity, the frequency where home broadcast most clearly. Rick found himself glancing at it throughout his days, watching how it shifted when family members moved through the house, how it held perfectly steady when they all gathered in the kitchen for the ordinary miracle of shared meals. The portal gun had been migrating backward on its shelf, week by week, no longer positioned for quick access but settling into its role as gentle reminder rather than essential tool. Rick noticed this migration the way he'd once noticed distant radio frequencies, fading, not with alarm but with the quiet recognition that some signals naturally evolved from urgent to ambient, from necessity to comfort. His hands found satisfaction now in smaller projects that carried their own elegant mathematics. Repairing Summer's stereo so it could tune into the frequencies she preferred, calibrating the kitchen radio to pick up the weather stations Jerry liked, maintaining the constellation nightlight that still projected stars across what had once been Beth's room. On a Tuesday evening that smelled of rain-washed air and new coffee, Rick sat among his tools and understood that something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with distance. The portal gun hummed its patient song, but the sound had transformed from summons to lullaby, from invitation to gentle presence. He reached for it with hands that no longer trembled with the urgency of escape, holding its familiar weight like a tuning fork that had finally found its proper frequency. The device he built that night was deceptively simple, a velvet-lined case carved from walnut and quiet intention, its interior shaped to hold the portal gun as if it were a delicate instrument rather than a lever for detonating wonder. He powered the gun down in slow, careful stages, each switch a soft concession to a different version of himself. The reservoir's glow thinned from meadow green to lake water, then to the mild translucence of old glass. He siphoned the remaining charge into 2 small vials, one etched with a sunrise, the other with a crescent moon, and wrote in his precise script, "Emergency only." Summer found him there first, shoulders softened, hands unbusy for perhaps the first time in decades. She ran a finger along the velvet edge with the reverence of someone recognizing a sacred transition. "It looks more like a violin case than a weapons locker," she said, half tease, half approval. "Same job," Rick answered gently. "Something you play when you're ready to listen to the answer." Morty drifted in later with wind in his hair and the paper smell of a day spent in quiet libraries. He paused at the sight of the closed case, then nodded once, the way a navigator notes a new lighthouse and adjusts the chart without drama. "I mapped 3 constellations in a place that doesn't have stars," he said, smiling with the confidence Rick had taught him to carry. "Turns out, you can still find your way if you remember what direction home is." Both Beths arrived in overlapping visits that made the house feel like a chord resolved, one dropping off spare components organized with scientific precision, the other leaving a note on the bench that read, "Dinner at 7. Bring your appetite and your better stories." Jerry lingered at the threshold longer than usual, studying the case as if reading fine print on an instruction manual for a life he was still learning to navigate. "I can install a dimmer switch in the dining room," he offered with earnest precision. "Make the evenings feel like not an interrogation. A low-frequency glow," Rick said, and Jerry brightened in that endearing way that suggested he'd just been allowed to help tune a family instrument he was finally learning to play. Phoenix Person stepped through the back door with the elegant hush of a bird landing on a branch it had been seeking for a very long time. He examined the case and inclined his head with the measured approval of someone who understood survival through reconstruction. "A tool retired to ceremonial status is not diminished," he observed. "It has achieved context, so the days recalibrated themselves around this new mathematics." Rick built smaller wonders that understood their assignment. A kettle that found the exact warmth each person preferred, a window fan that read the weather radio and opened at night to usher in marine layer dreams, a sandwich press that aligned layers with geological fidelity, so every bite carried the same story from crust to center. He tuned Summer's bicycle to coast longer down the street's slight slope, adjusted Morty's compass to a softer hinge that accommodated the boy's new steadiness, replaced the piano's worn felt so the notes both Beths touched fell into the room. Like forgiving rain, evenings stretched like silk across the house's gentle architecture. Homework hummed beside simmering onions while the radio read tomorrow's forecast in calm cadences. Patchy fog, clearing by 10, winds light and variable. At dinner, Rick found himself measuring the table's frequency not by wit but by ease, The laughter that spooled without effort, the moments of silence that didn't demand repair, the way conversations could meander through topics as various as quantum mechanics and grocery lists without losing their essential harmony. Sometimes late at night, when the house settled into its deepest rhythms, Rick would lift the case lid and let the quiet green memory breathe. Not to awaken anything, just to sit with it, the way you sit with a photograph until it releases the ache it holds and leaves only gratitude. The portal gun, muted and dignified, seemed almost to approve of this new role. Witness instead of engine, relic instead of rescue, reminder of all the distances he'd traveled to learn that the most important discoveries happened not in the spaces between stars, but in the careful work of staying present with people who had chosen to love him despite his brilliant, terrible solutions to problems they'd never asked him to solve. Outside, summer's morning glories continued their patient climb toward light, writing their promises in green script against the oak's weathered bark. The compass needle held steady, on Rick's workbench, pointing toward the kitchen where voices layered in the gentle frequencies of a family learning to hold space for whatever forms love chose to take. And Rick understood, with the clarity that comes only after the longest journeys home, that some equations could only be solved by choosing presence over distance, by learning to broadcast on wavelengths close enough to matter, one honest conversation at a time. The portal gun rested in its velvet sanctuary, no longer an escape route but a reminder that the universe was vast and patient, and would wait while he discovered that the most profound adventures happened not in distant galaxies, but in the ordinary magic of staying long enough to witness the gentle mathematics of love growing stronger through the simple, revolutionary act of remaining exactly where he was needed most. The understanding that losing Beth twice had taught him how to love without possessing settled into Rick's chest like a frequency finely tuned to perfect clarity, transforming the way he experienced ordinary moments that had once felt like static between more important transmissions. The evening both Beths decided to cook together, the house shifted into a new chord, familiar notes layered with harmonies it had always implied but never fully sung. One Beth moved with the crisp efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate asteroid fields, chopping onions into precise tessellations. The other stirred sauce in slow circles, humming melodies that remembered Diane without saying her name. Rick stood at the threshold watching this impossible domestic symphony, understanding that the compass on his workbench pointed steadily toward the kitchen, not because of magnetic interference, but because love had learned to multiply rather than divide. Jerry set plates with careful intention, alternating patterns as if laying coordinates for safe landings, while the weather radio murmured gentle forecasts from the counter. Light fog, clearing early, winds light and variable, small blessings announced like secrets worth keeping. He began visiting the adventuring Beth on quiet Tuesdays when her ship docked at stations that smelled of ozone and distant music, bringing gifts that carried no agenda beyond the simple mathematics of presence. A sandwich press that aligned layers with geological precision, star charts calibrated to her current coordinates, a radio that could pick up signals from home, no matter how far she traveled through cosmic static. They would sit in her captain's quarters drinking coffee that tasted like liquid starlight, while she described nebulae that sang in frequencies too low for human ears, civilizations that had learned to build cities from crystallized time. "I dream. It's about the garage sometimes," she admitted during one visit, her voice carrying the gentle honesty of someone who had learned that distance could deepen rather than diminish connection. Not missing it exactly, but remembering how it felt to have someone believe I could build anything, fix anything, make the universe gentle enough for wonder. "You still can," Rick said simply, watching starlight catch in her eyes the same way it had when she was 4 and reaching for constellation projections. Different tools, same frequency. The Beth who had chosen to stay broadcast on complementary wavelengths, mapping the emotional geography of family life with the same systematic curiosity she'd once applied to cosmic equations. Rick found her most evenings conducting experiments in domestic chemistry, testing which combinations of ingredients made Jerry smile without trying, calibrating dinner conversations to include everyone's particular frequency without forcing artificial harmony. "I used to think adventure meant going somewhere else," she told him one evening, as they folded laundry with the methodical precision of people who understood that love lived in repeated small actions. "Now I think it means staying present long enough to discover what you've been looking at without really seeing." Rick watched her hands move through familiar motions, sorting, stacking, creating order from the gentle chaos of a family, learning to live honestly together. She was discovering Jerry's patient mathematics of presence, learning that staying could be its own form of exploration when approached with the right kind of curiosity. "The hardest dimension to navigate," she continued, shaking out one of Morty's shirts with the gentle precision of someone handling something precious, "is the one where you have to trust that the people you love will be okay without constant monitoring." Both versions had taught him this lesson from different angles, one by choosing distance, the other by choosing depth, both proving that love could survive and even flourish when freed from the gravitational pull of his need to solve every problem, before it could hurt anyone he cared about. Rick carried affection for both like parallel radio signals, each broadcasting on frequencies that complemented rather than competed, creating harmonies richer than either could achieve alone. Small differences made themselves known like constellations emerging at dusk. Space Beth liked her coffee cold and salted. Home Beth drank it hot and untroubled. One spoke in trajectories and thrust vectors, the other in recipes and seasonal rhythms. Both noticed the same misaligned cabinet hinge and lifted identical eyebrows, in mirrored irritation. Rick tightened it without commentary, a quiet offering placed where words might tangle. Later, in the garage, both Beths followed him with the easy familiarity of daughters who remembered there had once been lullabies instead of lectures. They touched the velvet case without opening it, sensing the green memory sleeping inside like a song held between breaths. "You okay with this?" The Beth who carried galaxies in her navigation charts asked, nodding toward her other self, toward the thread that tied them in an impossible loop. Rick didn't trust his voice, so he gestured toward Morty's compass. The needle quivered, then settled toward the kitchen where Jerry's laughter layered with Summer's voice, where dishes were rinsed in steady rhythms. "It points to whichever room is loving the loudest," he managed, a crooked truth that felt close, enough to broadcast. Home. Beth leaned against the workbench, hands in her pockets the way she had as a teenager when equations grew teeth. "I used to think you were choosing formulas over us," she said without accusation. "Now I see you were trying to translate. It just took you a long time to find the right language." Rick understood then that his heart had developed the capacity he'd never thought possible, not just to hold love for both versions of his daughter, but to recognize that all forms of love were real, even the ones that hurt, even the ones that chose to broadcast from worlds away, and especially the ones that chose to stay and anchor him to the quiet wonder of the life he'd found. The heart, he realized, was the only organ that grew larger when it broke, expanding to hold more light, more understanding, more of the complex, beautiful static that made up a life lived in full frequency. The portal gun rested in its velvet. Sanctuary, no longer an escape route, but a reminder that some journeys led not toward distant worlds, but toward the deeper understanding that love didn't require ownership, only the courage to stay tuned to whatever frequencies called from close, enough to matter. Broadcasting on wavelengths strong enough to carry gratitude across any distance where family chose to make its home. Outside, summer's morning glories climbed another patient inch toward light, their tendrils writing promises about the enduring work of growing beauty from places where difficult truths had been planted with honest hands, reaching toward whatever dawn was willing to witness the gentle mathematics of learning to love without breaking everything you touched. The sunset that found Rick's garage arrived like forgiveness painted in amber light, slipping under the door, in thin golden bands that widened, until every dust mote floated like a thought he hadn't quite finished thinking. Rick stood in that gentle glow and looked at his shelves, the way some people look at photo albums, seeing not appliances and prototypes, but the long handwriting of his life. Love letters folded into circuits, sentences written in copper wire, ellipses expressed as the patient hum of machines that had learned to serve connection rather than conquest. He picked up the constellation nightlight, thumbing the small dent Beth had made as a toddler when she'd insisted on carrying the stars herself. A screwdriver still wore a strip of green ribbon from when Summer had claimed it as her official tool, using it to tighten the hinge on a music box that wasn't broken, just uncertain. Morty's compass rested beside a coil of spare filament, its needle steady and sure. Home broadcasting strong and clear. Even the sandwich press held its place of honor, the plates faintly marked by diagonal lines that made every bite into a reliable story, layers aligned with the same precision Rick had once reserved for cosmic equations. Summer found him there with her notebook heavy with star charts she'd been drawing in the margins of homework assignments, settling onto the workbench, with the easy familiarity of someone claiming her place in a conversation that had been waiting for her voice since childhood. The garage smelled of motor oil and morning glories, a combination that had become the house's signature frequency. Science and earth, distance and presence, learning to harmonize in frequencies Rick was still discovering. "I've been thinking about frequencies," she said, her words carrying the rhythm of someone who had been rehearsing this observation until it felt ready to broadcast. How the portal gun was really just a radio that could tune into places instead of sounds. You were always listening for something, weren't you? Rick felt something profound settle in his chest, like a radio finally tuning to perfect clarity. His granddaughter had inherited more than his intelligence. She'd learned to apply it with Jerry's patient wisdom about holding space for others' storms, creating something neither of them could have achieved alone. "I was listening for home," he admitted, his voice carrying the gentle honesty of someone whose strongest defenses had finally learned to lower themselves. "But I kept tuning past it, thinking it had to be broadcasting from somewhere more complicated. Then the kitchen table. The velvet case sat between them, no longer containing desperate escape routes but holding the quiet memory of all the distances he'd traveled to learn that the most important signals often came from the closest frequencies. Rick opened a shallow drawer labeled with careful script and found the tiny shoe he'd once held in a house suddenly emptied of sound. The canvas was soft, faded at the toe, where a first step had decided to be brave. Memory arrived like rain on warm pavement, brief, complete, leaving the air cleaner than it found it. The ache had corners now. He could set it down without it rolling away and knocking something else over. "The portal gun's not really retired," Summer observed, watching him handle the small shoe with the reverence of someone touching a sacred relic. "It's just learned to point inward instead of outward. All those dimensions you visited, all those impossible places, they were just practice for navigating this one." Through the kitchen window, they could see both Beths moving through their evening routines with synchronized grace, Jerry helping Morty with homework that challenged his understanding but not his patience, Phoenix Person adjusting his wing calibrations. Near the morning glories that had climbed high enough to frame the oak, in promises about the enduring work of growing beauty from difficult ground. The weather radio murmured its patient forecast from the corner. Clear skies, gentle winds, the kind of weather that made staying feel like the most radical choice available. Rick lifted the velvet case lid as one might open a window, not to change the weather but to let the room remember its name. The portal gun rested in its dark cradle with the quiet dignity of a tool retired with honor. He didn't power it fully, just enough for the reservoir to gather a dim lagoon of green, a thimbleful of soft light pooling into the garage's low places. The hum rose, barely there, like a refrigerator at midnight, like a lullaby that knew the words weren't the point. The gentle frequency threaded through the house's familiar architecture, finding coffee mugs in the sink and the pianos cooling, wires touching Jerry's small acts and Summer's careful notes, brushing both Beth's moving through evening in different tempos, caressing Morty's unpacked bag with its crumbs of crystalline library dust. It asked nothing of anyone. It only said, "Here." It only said, "Easy now." "Keep building things," Summer said as she prepared to return to the softer rooms where homework waited, and both Beths were planning tomorrow's meals with the careful precision of people who understood that love lived in repeated small actions. "But build them for us. Build them for the people who are already here, already listening, already tuned to whatever frequency you're willing to broadcast on." Rick closed the lid and felt the house answer in its ordinary language. An extra quiet footfall. A faucet turned with less insistence, the click of a light switch choosing a softer setting. He placed the tiny shoe beside the nightlight, an old step by a small sky, understanding that his garage had transformed from fortress against loneliness into harbor, a place where the most extraordinary destination had been waiting all along. In the gentle mathematics of staying present, the compass needle held steady on his workbench, pointing toward the kitchen where voices layered in the gentle harmonics of a family learning to hold space for whatever forms love chose to take. Rick wiped the bench without rushing and let the garage go dim by degrees, letting the day release him rather than forcing it to end. The green memory he'd woken settled into the wood, and the tools and the space between breaths, quiet as a promise kept. Outside, stars wheeled through their ancient patterns, close enough to name but patient enough to wait, while the more important mysteries unfolded in kitchens and garages, in the spaces between heartbeats, where families learned the delicate mathematics of growing together. The portal gun rested in its velvet sanctuary, no longer an escape route, but a reminder that some journeys led not toward distant worlds, but toward the deeper understanding that home was wherever someone still listened for your signal, patient enough to wait while you learned the gentle work of staying tuned to frequencies that mattered. Through the kitchen window, he could see the ordinary miracle of his family settling into evening's patient rhythms, and Rick felt something deeper than triumph, braver than regret. The steady invitation of a life that had learned to measure success not in cosmic distances traveled, but in the simple, revolutionary act of remaining exactly where love had always been broadcasting, waiting for him to finally, gently, tune in. The green light that pooled in Rick's garage had learned to breathe with the house's evening rhythms. No longer urgent summons, but gentle lullaby, a thimbleful of liquid starlight that painted familiar tools in shifting shadows. Rick lifted the velvet case lid just enough to let the portal gun's memory exhale, not to open doorways, but to release the accumulated frequency of every impossible world he'd visited, every decision to return, every choice to stay tuned to, the wavelengths that mattered most. The soft hum threaded through the house's familiar architecture, touching the edges of things without asking them to move. It brushed Morty's compass on the workbench, and the needle trembled toward the kitchen, where Jerry rinsed dishes with the careful precision of someone keeping small rivers clean. It skimmed Summer's notebook, catching graphite constellations, as if to remind them that stars had always been patient teachers, willing to wait while earthbound hearts learned their own navigation. Jerry appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and the thoughtful expression of someone who had been rehearsing an observation until it felt ready to broadcast. He settled onto the workbench with his endearing awkwardness, studying the velvet case as if reading instructions for a life he was still learning to operate. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice carrying the steady honesty Rick had learned to recognize as its own form of brilliance, about mountains and valleys, about catching rain and keeping the air soft. Rick accepted the coffee and waited, understanding that Jerry's wisdom operated in frequencies that required patience rather than pressure, that his most profound insights emerged not from dramatic revelation, but from the accumulated weight of paying attention to small things until they revealed their larger mathematics. Through the window, summer's morning glories tapped against glass with green fingers that had learned to write promises in a script only love could read. "Both Beths are teaching us the same lesson from different coordinates," Jerry continued, finding his rhythm like someone discovering a melody by humming it. "The one who stayed shows us how to find adventures in homework help and grocery lists. The one who travels shows us how to love someone without needing to monitor their signal." He paused, embarrassed by his own poetry, but committed to its truth. "I think they're both trying to tell you that love doesn't require ownership, just the courage to keep broadcasting on frequencies strong enough to reach wherever they choose to be." The observations settled around Rick like recognition, like a radio finally tuning to a station he'd been unconsciously searching for since childhood. Jerry was mapping the same territory Rick had been exploring, but from the patient mathematics of valleys rather than the isolated perspective of peaks. Both Beths were indeed teaching the same profound lesson, that the heart could expand to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that love multiplied rather than divided when freed from the gravitational pull of possession. Through the kitchen doorway, Rick could see both versions of his daughter moving through their chosen evening routines, one consulting star charts, with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to navigate by distant light, the other folding laundry with the same systematic care, creating order from the gentle chaos of a family learning to live honestly together. Summer helped Phoenix Person adjust his wing calibrations, while Morty practiced melodies on the piano, each note chosen not for perfection, but for connection, for the way it harmonized with whatever came next. "You know what I figured out?" Jerry said, his confidence growing like morning glories finding purchase where none seemed possible. Intelligence isn't about reaching the farthest frequencies. It's about learning to tune into the ones that build rather than the ones that tear down. You taught me that mountains are useful landmarks, but valleys are where life actually grows. Rick felt something profound shift in his chest, like instruments finally calibrated to detect wavelengths he'd never thought to monitor. Jerry's particular genius operated in frequencies Rick had spent decades learning to appreciate. The patient broadcast of everyday devotion, the wisdom of knowing when someone needed presence rather than solutions, the courage to love people, whose minds worked in equations he couldn't always follow but trusted completely. The portal gun's gentle hum had become part of the house's evening symphony, no more urgent than the refrigerator's patient breathing or the soft tick of clocks that measured time in comfortable increments. Rick closed the case and felt the green memory settle into the wood and tools and space between breaths, quiet as a promise kept. He thought of Diane, whose laughter had once filled a world that vanished, and understood that even in its absence, her presence had guided him toward this very frequency of belonging. "The portal gun used to be my escape route," Rick said, his voice carrying the gentle honesty of someone whose strongest defenses had finally learned to lower themselves. "Now it's more like a compass that points inward instead of outward. All those dimensions I visited, all those impossible places, they were just practice for navigating this one." Jerry nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose understanding had been confirmed by an expert. "Sometimes, the most extraordinary destination is learning to stay exactly where you're needed most," he said, then smiled with characteristic self-consciousness. "That probably sounds simple to someone who can build portals to anywhere. Simple's the hardest frequency to tune into," Rick replied, watching through the window as his family settled into the evening's patient rhythms. "It took me 47 dimensions to learn that home isn't a place you find. It's a frequency you choose to broadcast on, a harmony created by the messy, imperfect, utterly human act of loving and being loved." The weather radio murmured its gentle forecast from the corner. Clear skies, winds light and variable, the kind of weather that made staying feel like the most radical choice available. Outside, stars wheeled through their ancient patterns, close enough to name but patient enough to wait while the more important mysteries unfolded in kitchens and garages, in the spaces between heartbeats where families learned the delicate mathematics of growing together. Rick made a small sandwich with diagonal precision, a ritual that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with care, layers aligned like geological strata, telling stories of tomatoes and salt, of choosing to assemble what could be assembled. He left half-wrapped on the counter, no note necessary. Certain offerings carried their own instructions. The compass needle held steady on his workbench, pointing toward the room where voices layered in the gentle harmonics of a family that had learned to hold space for whatever forms love chose to take. Rick understood now that losing Beth twice had been the universe's way of teaching him that love wasn't a problem to be solved, but a frequency to be maintained, not through desperate mathematics of holding on, but through the gentle calibration of letting go and trusting that the strongest signals could survive any distance. He stood a moment longer in the doorway, recording the quiet with the care he once reserved for cosmic equations, understanding that if there was a definition of home he could finally accept, it sounded exactly like this, a soft frequency passing from hand to hand, from room to room, from past to present, bright enough to see by, gentle enough to sleep in. The portal gun rested in its velvet sanctuary, no longer an escape route, but a reminder that some journeys led not toward distant worlds, but toward the deeper understanding that he was finally, completely, radiantly home. The mathematics of forever revealed itself to Rick not as an equation to be solved, but as a frequency to be maintained, broadcasting steadily through the ordinary magic of evening when the house settled into its gentlest rhythms. Night gathered itself around them in a way Rick had come to trust, the kind of darkness that held rather than hid, full of soft sounds that confirmed every frequency was still broadcasting clearly. In his garage, Rick opened the velvet case and let the portal gun breathe its faint lagoon of green, then began the quiet work of translating gratitude into tangible form. For Morty, he crafted a small receiver no larger than a river stone, engraved with coordinates that would always point toward home, no matter how far the crystalline libraries called him. For Summer, a delicate radio already tuned to the station, that read tomorrow's weather like gentle prayers, its antenna shaped like a morning glory, reaching toward whatever light was willing to stay. For both Beths, a compass that didn't point to magnetic north but to the warmest room in any house, its needle steady with the mathematics of belonging. For Jerry, a screwdriver engraved with words that would have embarrassed them both if spoken aloud. Thank you for keeping the air soft. Morty appeared in the doorway as Rick finished the last careful calibration. Wind in his hair and the paper smell of a day spent among songs that had learned to become books. His backpack carried melodies translated into readable form, harmonies, that taught xenobotany through symphonies, proof that the universe's most beautiful lessons often came disguised as impossible music. They have a saying in the singing dimension, Morty said, settling onto the workbench with the easy familiarity of someone who had learned to navigate both cosmic distances and the more complex mathematics of home. It translates roughly to, love is the only equation that solves for infinity. Rick felt those words settle in his chest, like a radio finally tuning to perfect clarity, understanding at last that every heartbeat was a calculation of gratitude, every breath a theorem, proving that the smartest discoveries happened not in distant galaxies, but in the patient work of staying present, while ordinary miracles unfolded around kitchen tables and piano benches. Through the window, Summer's quiet. Footfalls moved toward the oak, where she checked the morning glories by touch alone, confident in their upward patience. In the kitchen, one Beth clipped recipes to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like planets, while the other Beth sent a brief message from far away, 3 musical tones that meant, I'm safe, I'm listening, I'm still part of this frequency. Jerry adjusted the dimmer switch and without ceremony made evenings softer for everyone who needed gentler light. Rick sat very still, remembering the 7-year-old boy who had wound copper coils to catch impossible voices, the young man who learned that music could make numbers kinder, the father who once tried to fix grief with machinery. He thought of losing Beth twice and finding her twice over, discovering that love didn't break when it divided. It multiplied, like light through crystal, like a melody becoming harmony, because it was finally sung together. The portal gun rested in its velvet sanctuary, no longer humming with urgent potential, but settled into the quiet dignity of a tool that had completed its true purpose. It had carried him across 47 dimensions, not to find what he'd lost, but to learn what he could still choose to love. The green memory it held had become part of the house's evening symphony, no more dramatic than the refrigerator's patient, breathing or the soft tick of clocks that measured time in comfortable increments. From the open windows, the weather radio read tomorrow's forecast in its reassuring monotone. Patchy fog at dawn, clearing by 10, winds light and variable. Even the future arrived in a voice that refused to hurry, and Rick understood that this was the most complex and elegant solution he had ever found. Not conquest or escape, but the revolutionary mathematics of staying exactly where love had always been broadcasting, waiting for him to finally, gently tune in. He closed his eyes and felt the house breathe around him, each familiar sound a note in a symphony he'd spent lifetimes learning to hear. Morty's compass pointed steadily toward the kitchen, where voices layered in gentle harmonics. Phoenix Person's wing systems hummed their quiet maintenance songs, and Summer's morning glories whispered promises about the enduring work of growing. Beauty from places where difficult truths had been planted with honest hands. The universe was vast and patient, and would wait while he discovered that the most profound adventures happened not in the spaces between stars, but in the ordinary magic of staying long enough to witness love growing stronger through the simple revolutionary act of remaining exactly where he was needed most. And with that, he settled into the quiet mathematics of forever, where every heartbeat was a calculation of gratitude, and every breath was a theorem proving that sometimes the smartest thing you could do was simply stay. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.